Hello there, and welcome to The Sleepy Scholar. Tonight's journey takes us through the history of life on Earth, from a young planet learning to hold oceans, to the first cells that learn to copy themselves, and onward through forests, reefs, dinosaurs, mammals, and humans. If you enjoy these quiet explorations, consider subscribing so you can easily return here whenever you need to rest. For now, get comfortable. Let your eyes grow heavy. Let's begin. Earth began its story as a world of heat, and over long ages it learned to keep a skin of solid rock. As the surface cooled, water vapor condensed, and rain no longer flashed back into steam. Oceans gathered in basins, turning the planet into a sphere of dark water and drifting stone. The air above was not yet the familiar blend that later feeds forests and lungs, but a restless veil shaped by volcanoes, impacts, and sunlight. The moon pulled on those first seas, stirring tides that mixed coastlines and carried minerals into the shallows. Continents were smaller and more mobile, stitched from volcanic islands and fragments of crust. Even the length of a day was changing as Earth's spin slowly relaxed under lunar gravity. In that unsettled setting, the stage for life was not one place, but many places. Those early seas held ingredients that modern oceans carry only in traces, including abundant dissolved iron and other reactive metals. Along coasts, shallow pools filled, evaporated, and refilled, concentrating molecules until they met often enough to link into longer chains. Wet and dry cycles can build bonds, then test them, repeating a gentle filter over and over again. Lightning and ultraviolet light supplied bursts of energy, while mineral surfaces offered scaffolding that could hold molecules in useful positions. Some carbon-rich compounds likely arrived on meteorites, adding new raw material to the mix. In the deep, new seafloor cracked as it cooled, letting seawater seep downward and return through vents. Mineral chimneys grew where hot fluids met cold water, creating porous walls full of tiny rooms. In those rooms, chemistry could become local, persistent, and busy. At some point, chemistry discovered copying, and the ocean became more than a solvent, becoming a theater for inheritance. A molecule that helps make another molecule like itself creates a lineage, even before there are cells or species. Copying did not need perfection at first, only enough reliability that a pattern could persist longer than it was erased by waves and dilution. Sequences of simple building blocks can store information in their order, and that order can guide what is built next, like a recipe written in matter. Imperfect copies introduced variation, and variation let environments favor some patterns over others. The sea, the rocks, and the temperature acted as silent judges, rewarding stability in one place and speed in another. Networks of reactions could cooperate, where one molecule supported another molecule's production. In time, copying became less a trick and more a way of living. Copying chemistry needed a place to concentrate, and boundaries became one of the earliest quiet miracles. Fatty molecules naturally assemble into bubbles in water, with one end attracted to water and the other avoiding it. These membranes form without any guiding hand, simply by the logic of their shapes. A membrane is not merely a wall, but a selective gate that keeps useful reactions close and lets waste drift away. Inside a bubble, chemical networks can link together, where one reaction supplies the next. When a bubble grows and splits, it can pass on a particular mix of ingredients, hinting at heredity. Over time, membranes could host catalysts and channels, turning the boundary into an active surface. Life's first homes were humble, but they already separated inside from outside, and that separation allowed identity to form. As protocells improved, they began to practice metabolism, the art of turning surroundings into usable energy and materials. Some early metabolisms likely relied on reactions between hydrogen and carbon dioxide, especially where fresh rock met water. In such places, geology can manufacture chemical fuel, and chemistry can learn to spend it. Alkaline vent systems are especially intriguing because they create natural differences in acidity across thin mineral barriers. Those differences resemble the gradients modern cells use to power themselves, like a charged slope waiting to be descended. A gradient is stored potential, and it can drive reactions forward without needing a spark each time. Minerals can also act as catalysts, lowering the barrier for key steps and making a pathway more reliable. With metabolism, a protocell is no longer only a container, but a system that feeds and renews itself. Eventually, true cells emerged, small and simple, yet already capable of astonishing variety. They spread through oceans and sediments, and wherever they lived, they altered their surroundings, taking in some molecules and releasing others. Different lineages learned different strategies, and the planet became a patchwork of invisible livelihoods. Some pathways fermented organic molecules for energy, while others used sulfur compounds as partners in chemical exchange. Some forms traded electrons with iron or other metals, turning rocks into part of their metabolism. Others produced methane from carbon dioxide, returning carbon to the air and water in a different guise. Even without oxygen, there were many workable ways to make a living. In this microbial age, Earth's chemistry was not a backdrop, but a participant being continually rewritten. Each niche taught a different lesson, and life gathered them all. In sunlit shallows, microbes learned that cooperation could be as successful as competition, and communities began to build in layers. Sticky films of cells trapped sediment grains and held moisture, making a stable platform in shifting water. Within these mats, one group's waste became another group's food, and scarcity in one layer could mean abundance in the next. Light and oxygen near the top could fade into darker chemistry below, creating gradients like stacked little worlds. Over time, some mats built stromatolites, mounded structures that look like stone, but are actually the architecture of many lives. Layer by layer, they rose slowly, preserving patterns of growth as the water delivered more sediment. Stromatolites became monuments that outlasted the individual cells that built them. In their quiet persistence, they show how life can shape its environment without haste. The young sun shone more faintly than it does today, yet Earth avoided becoming a permanent ice world through balancing feedbacks. Greenhouse gases such as carbon dioxide and methane trapped warmth, while rain and rivers helped weather rocks. Weathering can draw carbon dioxide from the air and lock it into minerals, slowly cooling the planet when the gas grows abundant. Volcanoes return carbon dioxide to the sky, warming the surface when the balance tips the other way. The result is a long conversation between mantle, ocean, and atmosphere, with no single speaker in control. Life entered that conversation by producing gases and altering how quickly certain reactions proceeded. Methane from microbes, for example, can warm a cold world, while other processes can reduce it again. Climate, chemistry, and biology began to braid together, and the braid only tightened with time. Far below the waves, the seafloor worked like a circulatory system, moving heat and chemicals through the crust. New oceanic crust formed at spreading ridges, cooled, cracked, and invited seawater down into its pores. There the water warmed and reacted with rock, changing its chemistry, then rose again to vent back into the deep. Around some vent openings, fluids can reach roughly 350 degrees Celsius, about 660 degrees Fahrenheit, even while nearby seawater remains close to freezing. These sharp contrasts create rich gradients, and gradients are invitations to metabolism. Mineral chimneys also provide sheltered pores where reactions can stay concentrated instead of dissolving into the open sea. Modern vent ecosystems show how life can thrive in such settings, even without sunlight. In the deep, stone and water collaborate, and a furnace becomes a habitat. As microbes lived and died, the ocean and the crust began to record their presence, turning Earth into an archive. Carbon that passes through life tends to favor lighter isotopes, leaving a subtle signature that can be preserved in ancient rocks. Layered sediments captured changes in iron chemistry, sulfur cycling, and productivity near the surface, like slow graphs drawn in mineral ink. Some of the oldest fossils are not bones or shells, but textures, microscopic shapes, and layered structures built by communities. When the rock record preserves such traces, it is preserving behavior as much as form, the habits of living chemistry. Over immense spans, this archive becomes thicker and more readable, because new minerals and new environments add pages. Life, too, began to archive itself in genes, refining what worked and discarding what did not. The planet became both stage and storyteller, storing evidence that would matter much later. In the sunlit surface ocean, some microbes began to treat water itself as a source of electrons, and the byproduct was a gas the planet had scarcely known. Oxygenic photosynthesis, likely pioneered by ancestors of modern cyanobacteria, turned light into chemical work with steady patience. At first, the oxygen did not travel far, because seawater and seafloor rock were hungry for it. Dissolved iron and sulfur compounds seized it, and volcanic gases helped consume it. So oxygen gathered in local oases near microbial mats, then vanished again into reactions. That pattern still mattered, because it rewarded cells that could tolerate oxygen and even use it. Some microbes built protective enzymes that disarmed reactive oxygen before it could damage delicate chemistry. On a restless planet, that was enough. Step by step, sunlight taught the planet a new chemistry, and the lesson would not be unlearned. As oxygen production continued, the oceans began to change color and character in ways that left signatures in stone. When oxygen met dissolved iron, the reaction produced iron oxides, minerals that can settle in layered bands and later harden into banded iron formations. These deposits are not merely rocks, but records of chemistry flipping states, as if the sea were turning pages under a slow hand. For long stretches, oxygen was made and immediately used up, never reaching the air in lasting amounts. The seafloor and sediments acted as a vast sponge, soaking up each breath of oxygen as soon as it appeared. Variations in circulation and productivity could change how fast oxygen arrived, which may help explain why some iron layers alternate in texture and composition. Yet every layer laid down quietly announced that the ocean was becoming more oxidizing, and that life was beginning to steer geology. Eventually, around 2.4 billion years ago, oxygen began to accumulate in the atmosphere in a shift often called the Great Oxygenation Event. The change was not a single instant, but a new balance in which production finally outran the planet's ability to absorb. Methane, a powerful greenhouse gas made by some microbes, reacts readily with oxygen, and as oxygen rose, methane likely declined. With less methane, Earth may have cooled, and ice could have advanced in episodes whose scale is written in ancient sediments. Oxygen also opened a new energetic pathway, aerobic respiration, which can extract more usable energy from food than many older routes. Some lineages learned to harness it, others sheltered in oxygen-poor corners, and the biosphere gained new layers. A once rare gas became a shaping presence, and the atmosphere took on a more modern personality, slowly and decisively. With oxygen in the air, the land surface began to rust, and red soils and red sandstones appeared where minerals oxidized in contact with the atmosphere. These red beds are like shoreline stains left by an invisible tide of chemistry, marking the moment the sky began to reach down to the ground. High above, oxygen interacted with ultraviolet light, helping create an ozone layer that absorbed some of the sun's most damaging radiation. The surface did not become gentle in a single leap, but it became less punishing, and new habitats slowly came within reach. Rivers carried oxidized minerals to the sea, changing nutrient availability and the way metals moved through ecosystems. Even rocks began to behave differently, because oxidation alters which minerals are stable at the surface. Earth's skin learned new rules, and life gained a wider stage on which to experiment. After these upheavals, the Proterozoic Earth settled into long stretches of relative stability, a calm that was not emptiness, but slow fermentation of possibility. Oceans could become layered, with oxygenated surface waters overlying deeper zones where oxygen was scarce and other chemistries ruled. Nutrients cycled, continents weathered, and the carbon cycle continued its deep conversation between rock and air, sometimes with life nudging the volume up or down. From a distance, the record can look quiet, yet quiet time is when subtle inventions spread and become dependable. Cells refine membranes, enzymes, and genetic regulation, learning to sense surroundings and respond with precision. Eukaryotes were still rare at first, but microbial worlds kept building soils, sediments, and chemical gradients. In these ages, the planet practiced steadiness, and life practiced patience. Both were preparing for a future when bodies would grow larger and ecosystems would become visible even from afar. Somewhere within that patient expanse, eukaryotic cells emerged, and with them came a new kind of complexity built from partnership. The leading idea is endosymbiosis. One cell engulfed another, and instead of digesting it, kept it as a resident. Over time, that resident became the mitochondrion, an internal power station that helped its host use oxygen efficiently. With mitochondria, cells could grow larger and maintain more elaborate internal structures because they had more energy to spend per gene. Eukaryotes also developed a nucleus to house DNA, along with internal membranes that compartmentalize chemistry like rooms in a house. This architecture allowed new kinds of control over timing and development, not just over survival. Predatory eukaryotes could swallow bacteria whole, reshaping food webs in the microscopic sea. A cell became a miniature city, and the city could support new kinds of citizens. Later, another partnership likely added a second engine, this time for capturing light in a refined way. When a eukaryotic cell took in a cyanobacterium and kept it, the captive became a chloroplast, and photosynthesis moved into new hands. Algae and other photosynthetic eukaryotes could bloom in surface waters, feeding food webs and drawing carbon dioxide from the air into living tissue. When those organisms died, some carbon sank strengthening the ocean's biological carbon pump and tying life more tightly to climate. Plankton also release oxygen, and their rise may have helped make surface waters more consistently breathable. Meanwhile, predators among eukaryotes learned to hunt other cells, driving an arms race of defenses, shells, and stealth. Some algae form partnerships of their own, living within other organisms and trading sugars for protection. In the microscope, the ocean became a busy sky of drifting worlds. Eukaryotes also introduced new ways to reshuffle heredity, and sex became one of the most consequential experiments in the history of life. By mixing genes from different individuals, sexual reproduction creates new combinations quickly, giving populations more options when environments change. It is costly in the short term, yet powerful across long spans, like a library that constantly rearranges its shelves to discover new stories. Alongside sex, many eukaryotes evolved internal motors and scaffolds, letting them swim, crawl, and sculpt their own shapes. Cells began to communicate with chemical signals, cooperating in colonies where not every cell did the same job. When cooperation holds, a cluster can behave like a single organism, with division of labor and shared fate. Multicellularity was not one invention, but many attempts, and several would endure. The planet was learning what it means for life to have a body, not only a cell. As multicellular life tested itself, Earth's geography and chemistry were still preparing dramatic swings, including episodes when ice may have reached into the tropics. During the Cryogenian period, beginning around 720 million years ago, evidence suggests glaciations so extensive that oceans were capped by ice across vast areas. An icy planet reflects more sunlight, reinforcing cold in a feedback known as albedo, and once started, such freezing can be stubborn to end. Yet volcanoes continue to release carbon dioxide, and with weathering slowed under ice, that gas could accumulate over long time. Life persisted in refuges, such as cracks in sea ice, warmer waters near vents, and perhaps thin coastal bands of open water. Even under a roof of ice, circulation can move salts and nutrients, and chemistry can keep breathing quietly. The biosphere learned endurance, and the planet learned that near-frozen conditions still allow change. Ice became a temporary roof, not an ending. When the great thaws arrived, they left distinctive deposits, including cap carbonates that formed as warm waters met a carbon-rich atmosphere. These layers can blanket older glacial sediments like fresh plaster, a signature of a world swinging from white to blue again. The return of open oceans restored circulation, and nutrients washed from continents into seas newly receptive to blooms. As productivity rose, oxygen could increase in steps, and more energetic metabolisms became viable for more lineages. Carbonate platforms spread in warm, shallow seas, and the chemistry of seawater shifted as rivers resumed their long deliveries. In the wake of global ice, ecosystems were reset without being erased, and evolution had open space to explore. New minerals precipitated, new sediments accumulated, and new organisms found room to innovate. A thaw is not only warming, it is an invitation, and life accepted it. Multicellular life began as a gamble in cooperation, when cells chose to stay together instead of parting after division. In a cluster, some cells could specialize, handling movement, feeding, or reproduction, while others supported the shared body. This only works when cheetahs are restrained, so early multicellular lineages evolved ways to police membership, using chemical signals and adhesion like quiet agreements. Algae experimented with simple chains and sheets, while other groups formed clumps where inner cells lived in dimmer chemistry than the outside layer. Over time, developmental patterns emerged, with cells turning genes on and off in sequences like a slow choreography learned by repetition. A larger body also creates new problems, including how to move nutrients and remove wastes, and these problems shaped what could persist. Life was practicing teamwork, and the ocean was listening. By the late Proterozoic, interactions in the ocean were becoming more ecological than purely chemical, with food webs that had roles and rhythms. Tiny grazers could crop microbial films, and predators could influence which shapes and defenses survived. When an organism dies, its body becomes a nutrient package, and decomposers decide how quickly that package returns to circulation. Oxygen levels likely rose in steps, making it easier for larger animals to support active tissues and steadier metabolisms. Nutrients, such as phosphorus and nitrogen, moved through cycles that linked continents to coasts, because weathering and rivers feed the sea's productivity. Plankton blooms could brighten the surface waters, then sink as snowfalls of organic matter, feeding darker zones below. In this way, the ocean became a living economy, trading matter and energy with slow precision. In Ediacaran time, roughly 635 to 541 million years ago, the seafloor hosted communities that looked like living quilts spread across sediment. Many organisms were soft-bodied, leaving few hard parts to fossilize, so their presence is often captured as impressions, like the memory of a shape pressed into mud. Some forms were frond-like and anchored, reaching into gentle currents for dissolved nutrients, while others lay on the surface like broad leaves, perhaps absorbing food from microbial films. The seas were still dominated by microbes, and microbial mats could carpet the bottom, creating a stable skin over loose sediment. In such worlds, even a slow animal can alter its surroundings, simply by shading a patch or grazing a corridor. Bodies had arrived, and the seafloor was learning to host them with grace. Ediacaran seas also revealed how oxygen and energy set limits on design, because larger bodies must move oxygen inward faster than diffusion alone can manage. Thin, flat forms can breathe across their surfaces, while thicker bodies benefit from internal channels and coordinated tissues. As oxygen became more available, it expanded the design space, allowing organisms to be bulkier, more active, and more structurally complex. Sediments were becoming livelier as early burrowers began to disturb the seafloor, breaking up mats and mixing layers that had long stayed separate. Burrowing changes chemistry because it carries oxygen downward and brings buried nutrients back up, turning sediment into a dynamic habitat. New interactions followed, where one creature's digging became another creature's opportunity. Life and seafloor co-evolved, each shaping the other's possibilities in slow, steady partnership. Around 541 million years ago, the Cambrian began with seas that seemed suddenly crowded with recognizable animal body plans. Part of this suddenness is an illusion of preservation, because hard parts fossilize far better than soft ones. Yet genuine ecological change was also underway. Skeletons and shells appeared in many lineages, using minerals such as calcium carbonate and calcium phosphate to build armor, teeth, and supports. Much of this diversification unfolded on continental shelves, often in waters shallower than about 200 meters, around 650 feet, where light and nutrients meet in abundance. Once some animals could bite, crush, or pierce, others were pressured to hide, harden, or move more cleverly, and that feedback can accelerate innovation. The ocean became a neighborhood where strategies mattered, and where innovation could spread like a tide. Cambrian oceans were workshops for motion, where muscles and nervous systems became more coordinated and more reliable. Arthropods, with jointed limbs and segmented bodies, explored a design that could be scaled and modified for swimming, crawling, or grasping. Some carried spines and plates, not only for protection, but also to stabilize movement in shifting currents. Eyes evolved in multiple lineages, and even simple vision can transform ecology by making distance meaningful and timing precious. Trilobites, famous Cambrian arthropods, scuttled and swam through many habitats, leaving trackways that feel like signatures in the sand. Early chordates, distant relatives of later vertebrates, experimented with flexible support rods and swimming styles that made open water less intimidating. Life was learning how to move through space with intention, not just drift. As Cambrian ecosystems matured, the seafloor changed from a mostly undisturbed surface into a churned landscape full of tunnels and pockets. This shift is sometimes called an agronomic revolution, because burrowers began to plow sediment, altering how organic matter was stored and decomposed. Before widespread burrowing, dead material could accumulate beneath microbial mats, creating low oxygen layers where decay proceeds differently. With burrowing, oxygen penetrates deeper, and decomposition becomes faster and more complete, changing how nutrients return to the water. This mixing, known as biotubation, also reshapes habitats, creating hidden chambers and fresh surfaces for microbes to colonize. In a sense, animals began to engineer the seafloor the way mats once did, but with different tools. The bottom became a living workshop, and chemistry followed the new architecture. Rising diversity in early animal seas did not mean a smooth ascent, because ecology is a web that can be tugged into new shapes by climate and chemistry. Sea levels rose and fell over long intervals, expanding shallow shelves at some times and shrinking them at others. When shelves expand, they create more coastal habitat where life can diversify. When they shrink, communities are compressed and competition intensifies. Ocean chemistry shifted as continents weathered and delivered nutrients, and as currents redistributed heat and salt, changing where oxygen could accumulate. Even small changes in circulation can decide whether deeper waters stay fresh or become stagnant, and that decision echoes upward through food webs. Over time, these physical rhythms became part of evolution's tempo, a drumbeat beneath the waves. Earth's moving coastlines quietly redrew the arenas where ecosystems could flourish. By the Ordovician, beginning about 485 million years ago, ocean life expanded into richer reefs and more structured food webs. Plankton diversified, and their drifting blooms fed animals that filtered water or hunted in open space. Coral-like organisms, sponges, and other builders helped construct reefs, turning hard substrate into bustling cities where countless species found shelter. Brachiopods, crinoids, and early mollusks added to the architecture, while trilobites continued to roam with practiced ease. Early vertebrates, including jawless fish, explored new swimming styles and sensory worlds, testing what it meant to be a moving backbone in a moving sea. Cephalopods, relatives of modern squids and nautiluses, cruised as active hunters, showing how intelligence can be expressed as behavior long before it is expressed as a brain like ours. The ocean was becoming modern in its complexity, a layered world of builders, swimmers, and drifting life. Late in the Ordovician, Earth experienced an extinction event linked to climate shifts and changes in sea level, reminding the biosphere that stability can be temporary. When ice grows on land, sea level can fall, shrinking shallow seas that many marine organisms depend on. Losing coastal habitat is like losing rooms in a house, forcing communities into tighter spaces and breaking specialized relationships. Temperature and circulation changes can also reorganize oxygen and nutrient delivery, making some regions less welcoming and others briefly more generous. Yet extinctions are also redistributions of possibility, because survivors inherit emptied niches and new resources. As conditions changed again and seas rose, reefs and food webs were rebuilt in new patterns, with different winners and different balances. The rock record keeps these turning points like bookmarks in long chapters. The planet keeps turning, and life keeps finding ways to belong. Silurian seas, after the Ordovician losses, filled again with builders and wanderers, as if the ocean had decided to try a fresh arrangement of its rooms. Reefs returned, stitched from corals, sponges, and other architects that turn sunlight and calcium into shelter. In the water column, fish diversified, and jaws appeared in some lineages, changing how food could be taken and how armor and speed could answer. Sea levels rose, spreading shallow shelves where new communities assembled, while currents continued to braid heat and nutrients along continental margins. Near the coasts, the land itself began to change, because the first small plants were learning to tolerate air, light, and drying winds. Their arrival did not yet repaint the world in thick green, but it marked a profound expansion of habitat. The planet was beginning to grow ecosystems both above and below the tide line. The first plants on land were modest, but they solved grand problems in physiology and engineering. Water is plentiful in the sea, yet on land it must be gathered, stored, and defended from evaporation. So early plants evolved waxy cuticles and tiny pores called stomata to trade gases without drying out. Vascular tissues, strengthened by lignin, allowed water to rise through stems and gave those stems stiffness, turning sunlight into a steadier harvest. Instead of seeds, many early plants spread by spores, light enough to ride breezes and settle wherever moisture offered a foothold. Anchoring structures crept into the ground, beginning the slow invention of roots and the first true soils. These pioneers likely hugged damp margins at first, but over time, low mats and simple branching forms became a true land flora, and the air above them began to carry the scent of change. Fungi became crucial companions because they excel at chemistry in the dark spaces between roots and rock. Many fungi form partnerships with plants by wrapping roots in fine threads and trading minerals and water for sugars made in sunlight. This exchange helps plants survive on nutrient-poor ground, where fresh rock offers potential but not easy access. Fungal acids and enzymes can break down minerals, freeing phosphorus and other elements, while their filaments knit soil together and hold moisture like a living fabric. Some fungi likely helped early plants resist pathogens and tolerate stressful conditions, making the difference between a brief colonization and a lasting foothold. As plants and fungi spread, they accelerated weathering and changed how nutrients ran off into rivers and seas. In this way, fungi acted as both miners and recyclers, quietly making the continent more habitable for whatever would come next. Once plants and fungi began shaping the land, arthropods were among the first animals to follow, because their exoskeletons and segmented bodies already suited a world of air and uneven ground. Early terrestrial arthropods likely included millipede-like detritivores feeding on decaying plant matter, as well as predatory forms related to spiders and scorpions. Breathing in air demanded new plumbing, and many arthropods evolved internal tubes that deliver oxygen directly to tissues, avoiding the slow exchange that water breathers rely on. Their jointed legs made them skilled navigators of leaf litter, stems, and rough stone, and their hard outer coverings reduced water loss while providing protection. As they fed and burrowed, they helped shred plant material and mix early soils, speeding decomposition and nutrient cycling. Land was becoming a food web, not merely a surface, and arthropods helped build its first lattice. Plants catching light, fungi and arthropods processing the remains, and predators keeping the balance shifting. During the Devonian, the continents wore broader green cover, and plants grew taller, deeper rooted, and more diverse, transforming the flow of water across land. Roots fractured rock and stabilized banks, so rivers began to meander and build floodplains, rather than simply rush in braided channels. With more plant material entering soils, decomposers expanded their work, and organic carbon could be buried in sediments, subtly shifting the balance of carbon dioxide in air and sea. Some plants evolved true wood, allowing them to stand as trees and form the first forests, where shade and humidity created microclimates under the canopy. Forests also strengthened soils, reducing erosion in some places, while producing richer sediments in others, changing deltas and coastal habitats. The land, once mostly bare, started to influence climate and ocean chemistry through its new living skin. Greenery was no longer a novelty. It was becoming a continental force that reshaped climate, erosion, and the very architecture of ecosystems. As forests spread, oxygen became more consistently available in the atmosphere as a byproduct of photosynthesis. But the story was never a simple climb, because oxygen is also consumed by decay, fires, and reactions with rock. The geological record preserves charcoal, showing that wildfires became possible once enough oxygen and enough dry plant fuel coexisted on land. Fire reshaped landscapes by clearing patches, recycling nutrients, and favoring plant strategies that could resprout, regenerate from spores, or protect tissues with bark-like coverings. Lightning and drought could ignite a blaze, but the blaze itself became an ecological actor, selecting for resilience and creating open spaces where different plants could thrive. Smoke and ash altered soils and local chemistry, while repeated burning could keep some regions from becoming densely forested. Even in deep time, fire is both destruction and renewal, a strict editor that can carve variety into forests that might otherwise have grown uniform. Earth learned to burn, and life learned to answer. Devonian seas were equally inventive, and fish explored an array of forms so varied that the period is often remembered as an age of fish. Armored placoderms cruised coastal waters, while sharks and bony fish refined swimming with lighter skeletons and more flexible fins. In shallow, plant-lined waterways, some lobe-finned fish developed stout fin bones that could press against the bottom, turning a fin from a paddle into a prop. Air breathing also appeared in several groups, using lungs or lung-like structures to survive in warm, stagnant waters where dissolved oxygen could drop. In some lineages, buoyancy organs that began as lungs later became swim bladders, showing how a structure can be repurposed when environments shift. Meanwhile, feeding styles diversified, from suction and grazing to biting and crushing, as jaws and teeth evolved in new arrangements. The ocean was not only a place of swimming, It was a place of invention, where new solutions spread through lineages like currents carrying seeds. From lobe-finned ancestors came the first tetrapods, animals with limb-like structures that could support weight in very shallow water, and eventually on muddy ground. Early forms still depended on aquatic settings, and many likely hauled themselves through weed-choked channels rather than striding across dry land. Their ribs and vertebrae strengthened to resist gravity, while shoulder and hip regions became more robust platforms for muscles. Fingers and toes, at first more like paddles with multiple digits, offered purchase against the bottom, letting the body pivot, push, and lift in ways fins could not. Sensory systems adapted as well, because hearing and vision work differently in air than in water, and a head held near the surface experiences both worlds at once. The transition was not a single leap, but a gradual widening of comfort zones, as life learned that shorelines could be traversed rather than merely visited. The Devonian did not end in uninterrupted flourishing, and the fossil record shows pulses of extinction that affected many marine groups and reshaped reefs. Causes likely involved a mix of climate changes, sea level shifts, and altered nutrient flows from increasingly vegetated continents, which could influence oxygen levels in coastal waters. When nutrient delivery surges, blooms can rise and their decay can draw oxygen down, stressing animals that rely on well-oxygenated habitats. Reef builders are especially sensitive to such changes, because reefs depend on stable chemistry and clear, sunlit water to grow. As some communities declined, others spread into the openings, and ecosystems reorganized with new balances of predators, grazers, and plankton. On land, plants continued to diversify, and the groundwork for richer terrestrial habitats kept strengthening despite the turbulence offshore. Extinction in deep time is often a reshaping rather than a silence, and the Devonian's late chapters rearranged who would dominate the next act. By the Devonian's close, the stage was ready for wetter forests, larger insects, and new kinds of vertebrate life. As the Carboniferous began, warm wetlands spread across parts of the continents, and thick plant growth found places where waterlogged soils slowed decay. When dead plant material accumulates faster than it decomposes, it can be buried and transformed into coal, a geological memory of ancient sunlight. Towering club moss relatives and other swamp trees formed dense stands, and some could reach about 30 meters, around 100 feet, lifting spore-bearing crowns above the misty canopy. In such forests, fallen trunks and leaf litter created rich habitat for arthropods and amphibian life. Still tied closely to water, vast peatlands stored carbon in dark layers, while rivers threaded through them, delivering sediments that could bury organic matter and preserve it from complete breakdown. The air above these wetlands carried the chemistry of abundant plant growth, and the ground beneath carried the slow promise of future rock. The Carboniferous landscape was not only green, it was carbon becoming architecture, arranged into thick deposits by the patience of swamps. The result was a breathing, dripping world, where the boundary between land and water blurred into a continuous green labyrinth. When oxygen is plentiful, arthropods that breathe through internal tube networks can supply tissues more easily, and active flight becomes less constrained by diffusion. Fossils include dragonfly relatives with wingspans approaching about 70 centimeters, around 2 feet, sweeping above swamp channels like living kites. Wet forests produced vast amounts of plant matter, and when dead material fell into waterlogged ground, it could escape full decay and accumulate as peat. Burial of that carbon helped tilt oxygen upward, while fires and respiration pulled it back, keeping the atmosphere in conversation with the forests. In this world, oxygen was not just a gas, but a quiet partner in ecology, letting wings beat and muscles work with a little more ease. Above the swamps, the sky felt keen, and life used every advantage it offered. Amphibians flourished in carboniferous wetlands because the landscape offered endless margins where water and land interlaced. Many still depended on moist places for reproduction, laying eggs that needed wet shelter. Yet their bodies were learning to travel farther across leaf litter and fallen trunks. Broad skulls and sturdy limbs suited ambush along pools, while lungs and skin shared the work of breathing in warm, humid air. Dense vegetation made shade and moisture common, and tangled roots created hidden passages through mud and peat. Insects and other arthropods provided abundant meals, and decomposers turned fallen wood into rich, dark soil that fed the next generation of plants. Some amphibian lineages grew large, but even the smaller ones mattered because they stitched water and land into one continuous hunting ground. The wetlands were not a boundary line. They were an ecosystem in motion, and amphibians were among its most devoted citizens. A profound invention appeared more than 300 million years ago, when some vertebrates enclosed their embryos in a self-contained cradle known as the amniotic egg. By surrounding development with protective membranes and fluid, the egg reduced dependence on open water and made reproduction possible in drier places. This step opened the door to life that could live, breed, and spread far from ponds and marshes, following food rather than shoreline. Early amniotes soon diverged into major branches, including those leading toward reptiles and those leading toward synapsids, the deep family that later includes mammals. To thrive on land, these animals refined water-saving skin and kidneys that could conserve moisture, and they began to lay eggs in safer, more hidden sites. With each generation, the interior of a continent became less forbidding, not because the climate softened, but because biology learned new protections. A simple egg quietly widened the map of habitability. As the late Carboniferous shifted toward the Permian, continents continued to collide, and the world's geography tightened into a vast supercontinent. Pangaea gathered many land masses into a single interior far from the moderating influence of coastal seas. When land stretches thousands of kilometers, thousands of miles, from shore to shore, moisture struggles to reach the center, and climates can swing between long dry spells and sudden storms. Mountain ranges rose where plates pressed together, reshaping winds and casting rain shadows that dried broad regions. Along some coasts, monsoon-like circulation likely intensified, with seasons that alternated between soaking and parched. Rivers carried sediments across wide plains, building deltas when they finally met the sea, while inland basins could evaporate into salty flats. In this new geometry, life had to learn endurance because the continent itself had become a powerful climate-making machine. Permian landscapes hosted a changing cast of animals, including synapsids, whose skull architecture hints at deep kinship with later mammals. Early forms included sail-backed species with tall spines that may have helped exchange heat with the air, though the details remain debated. Later in the Permian, therapsids emerged, often with more upright limbs and more efficient jaws, giving them a new poise on dry ground. Herbivores with strong chewing surfaces processed tough seed plants, and predators responded with sharper teeth and new hunting styles. Plants evolved too, as seed-bearing groups such as conifers and their relatives gained advantage in climates where a vulnerable spore was easily dried. Burrowing insects and small vertebrates worked the soil, and fungi continued their quiet trade with roots. The land was becoming a mosaic of strategies, each one tuned to the new discipline of continental seasons. Permian oceans were transforming as circulation and chemistry responded to the new arrangement of continents. When a supercontinent forms, seaways can narrow or close, changing how water moves heat and oxygen across the globe. Coastal shelves may shrink, and deeper basins can become more isolated, especially when warm surface layers resist mixing with cooler depths. In stratified seas, oxygen delivered at the top may not reach the deep, and the seafloor can drift toward low oxygen chemistry, where different microbes thrive. Reefs and shallow communities still flourished in favorable places, but their stability depended on clear water, steady temperatures, and balanced nutrients. Plankton blooms could feed the surface while starving the depths of oxygen during decay, tightening the link between biology and circulation. Across the Permian, the ocean's pulse became more sensitive, as if the seas were breathing through narrower passages. Late in the Permian, Earth approached one of its most profound reorganizations, as if multiple planetary systems fell into a difficult chord. Massive volcanism in what is now Siberia produced immense flood basalts and released gases that warmed the climate and altered atmospheric chemistry over long intervals. Warming reduces how much oxygen seawater can hold, and it can strengthen stratification, making deep waters harder to ventilate. Added carbon dioxide can also shift seawater chemistry toward greater acidity, changing the conditions for shells and reefs. On land, altered rainfall patterns and wildfires could reshape vegetation, while weathering and runoff delivered new nutrient loads to coasts. The biosphere faced a world whose controls were being turned at once. Temperature, oxygen, and chemistry moving together. Even here, the story is not only loss, but the planet slowly searching for a new steady state. After the end Permian transformation, the world did not rebuild instantly. It recovered in stages, with simple communities often arriving first. In the oceans, opportunistic organisms and microbial mats could spread across disturbed seafloors, stabilizing sediments and restarting food webs from the bottom. Groups that tolerated variable oxygen and temperature tended to rebound earlier, and their presence created scaffolding for more sensitive lineages to return later. Reef building, which depends on stable chemistry and clear water, took longer to regain its former complexity, as if the sea needed time to settle its breath. On land, plant communities reassembled with hardy survivors that could handle dryness and heat, and soils slowly regained their layered richness. Small animals filled roles as scavengers, grazers, and hunters, keeping energy moving through the recovering web. Recovery in deep time is a kind of craftsmanship, and life rebuilt its habitats piece by piece. In early Triassic time, surviving lineages expanded into open niches, and the land became a testing ground for new balances. Reptile groups diversified, and among them archosaurs began to spread, a lineage that would later include crocodiles, dinosaurs, and their close kin. Some archosaurs experimented with more upright posture and efficient breathing, traits that help an animal move and regulate heat in broad, seasonal landscapes. Synapsids persisted too, though many were reduced in diversity, and some small forms lived as adaptable generalists, feeding on insects and plants in sheltered places. Amphibians remained important near waterways, keeping the ancient connection to water alive, even as the land dried and opened. Forests were not yet the lush cathedrals of later times, but patches of green-stitched riverbanks and uplands together. The Triassic world was learning its new rhythm, and evolution kept time with it. Through the Triassic, the vast supercontinent began to strain and fracture, and those slow tensions would eventually redraw climates and coastlines. Rifts opened where Pangaea stretched, forming long valleys and volcanic regions that reshaped landscapes with basalt, lakes, and new river routes. As coastlines lengthened in some areas, shallow seas returned, offering marine habitats where fishes, plankton, and reef builders could diversify again. The arrangement of seaways influences currents, and currents decide where nutrients rise, where oxygen lingers, and where warm water gathers. In sheltered bays, carbonate sediments accumulated, building broad platforms that invited marine communities to settle and grow. On land, seed plants spread across drier regions, and soils matured under their roots, storing water and shaping erosion. Each crack in the continent was a new ecological edge, a place where migrations could begin and new communities could meet. Geography was moving once more, and life moved with it, alert and inventive. Triassic climates often felt strongly seasonal, especially deep within Pangaea, where distance from the sea could make rain arrive in pulses and then fade for long stretches. Broad interiors favored plants that tolerated dryness, including conifers and cycads, while river margins carried greener ribbons of ferns and horsetails. Monsoon-like circulation likely swung moist air towards some coasts in one season and pulled it away in another, giving the same landscape alternating months of floodplain mud and cracked dust. Wildfires could sweep through dry fuel, then be followed by quick regrowth where spores and seeds waited. Soils were still maturing, yet roots and fungi were already knitting ground together and changing how rivers carried silt. Insects, amphibians, and reptiles learned to read this pulse of wet and dry, building lives around timing as much as place. Even the air carried resin scents, marking heat, dust, and drought. Small synapsids, including advanced cynodonts, carried a quiet set of traits that would later define mammals, even while larger reptiles dominated the open stage. Their jaws became more precise, with differentiated teeth that could slice and grind, allowing efficient use of insects, seeds, and small prey. A secondary palate in some forms let them breathe while chewing, a small engineering trick that supports steady eating and higher activity. Many were likely active in cooler hours, and hair or hair-like filaments would have helped conserve warmth and sharpen touch in burrows and leaf litter. Inside the skull, bones that once helped transmit jaw forces were shifting toward a new role in hearing, improving sensitivity to high-frequency sounds. These animals were not waiting for the future. They were building it, one refined sense and one efficient bite at a time. In their ribs and blood, metabolism was learning a new tempo. In the Triassic seas, recovery produced new marine balances, and the water column filled again with swimmers, drifters, and builders. Ichthyosaurs, streamlined like modern dolphins, hunted fish and squid-like prey, while other reptiles explored different designs for life in water, including early plesiosaurs with powerful flippers. Ammonoids diversified into many coiled forms, their chambered shells recording growth like a spiral diary that later hardens into stone, and their rapid evolution makes them useful time markers for geologists. Plankton blooms fed filter feeders, and sinking organic matter nourished life in darker layers below, tying surface light to deep chemistry. Even in recovery, the ocean was already layered like a moving city. On shallow shelves, clear water let corals and sponges raise reefs, and fish schools threaded those corridors of stone. As Pangaea stretched, long rift valleys opened and volcanism grew more frequent, preparing the ground for immense flood basalts near the Triasic's end. These eruptions, part of what geologists call the Central Atlantic Magmatic Province, spilled lava across wide areas and released gases over extended time, sometimes from fissures running hundreds of kilometers, hundreds of miles. Carbon dioxide can warm climate and also dissolve into seawater, shifting carbonate chemistry in ways that challenge organisms that build shells and reefs, especially when changes are fast. Volcanic sulfur compounds can form aerosols that alter sunlight and rainfall patterns, while warming seas can hold less oxygen, increasing the risk of stressed, poorly mixed waters. The continent was cracking open, and the atmosphere carried those chemical signals around the world. Those Atlantic flood basalts also reshaped terrain, building new highlands and sending mineral-rich runoff toward coastal waters. Near the boundary between Triassic and Jurassic time, many lineages declined, and the living web reorganized as if the planet had tightened its rules. The timing aligns with widespread volcanism and its cascading effects on temperature, rainfall, and ocean chemistry, though researchers still refine how different stresses overlapped across regions. In ecosystems under pressure, generalists often fare better than specialists, and organisms that can switch diets or tolerate variable oxygen can persist when familiar niches falter. On land, surviving archosaurs expanded into emptied roles, while small synapsids and amphibians found refuge in sheltered habitats along waterways. In the sea, disrupted food chains slowly reassembled as light, nutrients, and circulation returned to workable patterns. The boundary is not a single cliff in time, but a reshaping, and reshaping creates room for new dominance. In the aftermath, coastlines and food webs became simpler before they grew intricate again. In the earliest Jurassic, survivors built ecosystems on fresh foundations, and dinosaurs became more prominent as herbivores and predators across many regions. Sauropodomorphs trended toward larger size, with long necks that widened feeding reach and sturdy limbs that carried growing mass across floodplains. Theropod predators refined balance, vision, and tooth design, tracking prey through forests still dominated by conifers, ginkgos, and ferns, with cycads and horsetails in wetter pockets. Crocodile-line archosaurs persisted too, often tied to rivers and lakes where ambush and armor paid off. Warmer, humid climates in many areas encouraged dense vegetation along channels, creating green corridors across otherwise open ground. The Jurassic did not begin with a trumpet, but with steady accumulation, as if life had found a new rhythm and started to keep it. Rivers braided through basins, and footprints repeated on the same banks for generations. Early Jurassic seas mirrored this rebuilding, with continental shelves acting as sunlit factories for plankton, shell builders, and the animals that fed on them. Ammonites continued to diversify, and their quickly changing forms later became reliable guides through rock layers because each interval leaves a distinct signature. Belemnites, relatives of modern squids, added another swift thread to the marine tapestry, while bivalves and crinoids populated the seafloor like living machinery. Marine reptiles occupied different roles, some cruising the open water, others patrolling coasts, and their fossils show how rapidly the sea can repopulate when conditions stabilize. Reefs expanded where water stayed clear, and chemistry remained supportive, turning coastlines into habitats of ledges, crevices, and light. The ocean was rebuilding its rooms, and every current carried new tenants into place. Even the mud held clues, as burrows and shells stitched seafloor to sea. The Jurassic world often ran warm, and in many regions the difference between tropics and poles softened compared with later ages. Higher sea levels spread broad continental shelves, and shallow waters became wide stages where sunlight could reach the bottom. Carbonate sediments accumulated on these shelves as shells, algae, and microbial films turned dissolved minerals into structure, grain by grain. On calm platforms, the sea could lay down limestone like a slow mosaic, while storms and tides sculpted channels through it. Where shelves met deeper water, nutrients could rise along slopes and feed surface blooms, making coastal zones especially productive. Inland, warmth and humidity encouraged rivers to wander and flood, building plains that repeatedly renewed soils with silt. In such climates, growth was often vigorous, and ecosystems gained room to become dense and layered. On land, sauropods pushed the limits of body size, turning sheer scale into a way of life. A long neck widened the feeding radius without moving the whole body, and a barrel-like torso held an immense digestive system suited to processing tough foliage. Their bones balanced strength with lightness through internal air spaces, and their posture let them carry weight with steady efficiency. Trackways preserved in ancient mud show multiple individuals moving together, suggesting that at least some traveled in groups across floodplains. A giant animal also reshapes its surroundings simply by passing through, opening paths, knocking down branches, and returning nutrients in broad loops through waste and decay. Where they fed, plant communities could respond with regrowth, and where they trampled, new edges formed for smaller animals and insects. The landscape learned to accommodate giants, and giants learned to read the landscape. Theropod dinosaurs refined the art of motion, balancing long tails and strong hips to turn running into a controlled glide over ground. Their skulls evolved varied tooth shapes and jaw mechanics, reflecting different diets and hunting strategies across habitats. Many likely relied on scent, hearing, and sharp vision, using the same senses that guide modern predators, yet their lives were also shaped by scavenging and opportunism. Because in nature, food arrives in many forms. River margins, forest edges, and open plains each offered different chances, and a body tuned for one setting might struggle in another. Some theropods remained relatively small and agile, slipping through undergrowth, while others grew large and became the dominant movers in their regions. In this ecological dance, herbivores did not merely flee. They clustered, migrated, and used terrain, and the balance between them left its record in teeth marks on bones, in footprints, and in the steady turnover of populations. Beneath the feet of giants, early mammals persisted as compact specialists in sensing and survival. Many were likely nocturnal, not because night is easier, but because darkness can be quieter, cooler, and less contested by large daytime animals. Their teeth show precise occlusion, which helps process insects and small foods efficiently, turning a meal into usable energy with less waste. Enlarged brain regions for smell and hearing suggest that sound and scent were important maps in shadowed habitats, and whiskers may have turned touch into another source of certainty. Some lineages likely cared for young with milk, a quiet biochemical investment that allows offspring to grow quickly and survive in variable seasons. Burrows offered stable temperature and humidity, and leaf litter provided cover and insect prey, letting small bodies thrive in the margins. While the Jurassic celebrated size, these mammals practiced refinement, building the sensory and metabolic toolkit that would later bloom. Feathers became more common among theropod lineages, and what began as insulation and display gradually offered new aerodynamic possibilities. A feather traps air close to skin, smoothing temperature swings and supporting higher activity, and it can also signal identity through color and pattern in courtship and rivalry. Over time, forelimbs that already grasped could become broader surfaces, and a tail could become a steering fan, letting leaps and falls grow more controlled. Fossils such as Archaeopteryx preserve a mosaic of traits, with flight feathers paired to teeth and a long bony tail, showing evolution working through mixtures rather than clean categories. Gliding from trees or running with wing-assisted balance could both have been stepping stones, each one making the air a little more usable. When flight arrived, it opened a new corridor across landscapes, turning height into refuge and distance into opportunity. The sky gained inhabitants, and ecology gained a vertical dimension. As the Jurassic continued, the supercontinent's slow fracture widened, and new ocean basins began to claim space between separating lands. Young coastlines multiplied, creating more shallow habitats and more places where rivers met the sea with deltas and wetlands. Changing geography redirected winds and altered rainfall belts, because oceans store heat differently than continents do, and coastlines shape monsoon patterns by guiding where moist air rises. Rift valleys hosted lakes and volcanic plains, while new seaways acted like long corridors for marine migration, linking populations that had once been isolated. Even without dramatic mountains, small changes in elevation and shoreline can steer rivers and decide where sediment is deposited, and that sediment determines where fertile plains form. In this way, plate motion quietly rewrote the map of habitats, and life responded as it always does, by dispersing, adapting, and specializing along the new edges. In the Jurassic Ocean, microscopic life quietly controlled much of the energy economy, as plankton captured sunlight and turned it into food for the entire water column. Some groups built mineral shells or plates, and when they died, those tiny skeletons sank like a soft snow, carrying carbon toward the deep. This sinking helps connect surface productivity to seafloor chemistry, because decomposition consumes oxygen and releases nutrients that can later return to the surface through mixing and upwelling. In productive regions, the seafloor received a steady rain of organic matter, feeding worms, crustaceans, and microbes that recycle the remains. Over long spans, sediments stored this history, preserving microfossils that later allow scientists to reconstruct ancient temperatures and ocean conditions. The sea, from a distance, can look empty, yet it is crowded with makers whose work becomes rock. The Jurassic sea floor kept their signatures with patient fidelity. Reefs in many Jurassic seas formed bright, complex neighborhoods where clear water and stable chemistry allowed builders to thrive. Corals and sponges raised three-dimensional structures, and those structures provided shelter for fish, mollusks, and countless small animals that grazed, filtered, and hunted among the crevices. Ammonites drifted and swam through these waters, their coiled shells growing in chambers that recorded life as a spiral of time. Marine reptiles filled different niches, some built for speed in open water, others for maneuvering near coasts, and their presence reveals that large bodies can thrive at sea when food webs are dense. Storms periodically broke reefs and redistributed sand, but reefs rebuilt because their strength lies in repeated growth rather than in resisting every blow. In the interplay of light, calcium, and currents, the ocean wrote architecture that could last millions of years. Jurassic forests were built from ancient lineages that held the planet in green long before flowers arrived, and their textures shaped every animal that moved beneath them. Conifers raised resin-scented canopies, cycads spread stiff crowns like living fireworks, and ferns filled the understory in damp shade. Horsetails clustered along streams, their hollow stems turning floodplains into reed beds that could regrow after disturbance. Insects diversified within these plant worlds, using leaves, cones, and decaying litter as food, shelter, and nursery. Fungi threaded through soils and roots, trading minerals for sugars, and their hidden networks helped stabilize ground where storms and rivers constantly rearranged silt. Each fallen trunk became a brief island of decay, feeding beetles, worms, and microbes that returned carbon to the cycle. The forest was not decoration. It was a machine that converted light into structure, then returned structure to Earth again. Jurassic weather often arrived in rhythms that a landscape could learn, with seasons of heavy rain and seasons of dryness, shaping rivers like slow, repeating chisels. Floodplains spread where channels wandered, laying down fresh layers of mud and sand, then cutting new paths when storms swelled their flow. In rift basins and coastal lowlands, lakes could expand and shrink, leaving shorelines of cracked clay and bands of mineral salts when evaporation won the contest. Along warm coasts, limestone accumulated where shells and algae built carbonate sands, while in some restricted basins, evaporites formed as seawater concentrated, a reminder that sea level and circulation can change the taste of an inland sea. Volcanic regions added new ash and minerals, enriching some soils while briefly stressing others. Even without abrupt catastrophes, the Jurassic taught ecosystems to live with change in timing, not just change in place. A valley could look steady, yet every season rewrote its edges. Dinosaurs did not merely occupy Jurassic landscapes. They organized them through movement, feeding, and the simple physics of large bodies interacting with living ground. Herds could create durable paths between water and feeding areas, and repeated use compact soil, alter drainage, and open corridors through vegetation. Nesting behavior left its own imprint, because returning to favorable ground ties reproduction to particular sediments, temperatures, and flood risks. Some evidence suggests that at least certain species nested in colonies, which can concentrate nutrients and attract scavengers and predators, thickening the local food web around a seasonal event. Even solitary nesting still changes a landscape by digging, trampling, and defending. Juveniles likely occupied slightly different niches than adults, because size changes what can be eaten and what can be avoided. In this way, a dinosaur life cycle became part of ecosystem structure, like a river that returns every year to the same bend. In the ocean, parts of the Jurassic recorded intervals when deep waters grew starved of oxygen, leaving dark, organic-rich sediments that later hardened into black shales. One well-known episode in the early Jurassic, around 183 million years ago, is often linked to warming, altered circulation, and increased nutrient delivery that fueled surface blooms and then heavy decay below. When decomposition consumes oxygen faster than mixing can replace it, deep habitats contract, and organisms that rely on well-ventilated waters are pushed towards shallower or more dynamic regions. These conditions also help preserve organic matter, because less oxygen means slower breakdown on the seafloor, allowing carbon to be buried. That burial is a quiet lever in the carbon cycle, because it can remove carbon from the short-term atmosphere-ocean system for long spans. Even here, the story is not spectacle, but balance, with light at the surface and chemistry in the depths negotiating what the sea can sustain. As flight became more practical, early birds and bird-like dinosaurs explored new ways to use air, turning feathers into both insulation and instrument. Wings are not simply flat surfaces. They are adjustable structures with feather angles that can change lift and stability, allowing glides, flaps, and sudden turns through forest gaps. A tail can act as a rudder, and changes in tail length and stiffness reveal evolution refining control as much as raw power. Skeletons grew lighter through air-filled bones, and shoulder joints became better suited to repeated flapping, showing that flight depends on the whole body's architecture, not only on wings. Even partial flight can reshape survival, because reaching a branch, crossing a river, or escaping a ground predator by gaining height is a profound advantage. With birds, the air became a habitat with rules and opportunities of its own. Sound also traveled differently above the canopy, and song would later join the story as another way to claim space. By late Jurassic time, continental drift had widened young oceans and stretched coastlines into long, irregular margins that multiplied ecological edges. The Atlantic was opening. The vast Tethys Ocean connected warm waters across much of the globe, and shallow shelves expanded in many regions where seas invaded lowlands. These shelves are fertile because light can reach much of the water, and because tides and currents mix nutrients in ways that support plankton and reefs. On land, separating continents began to isolate populations, letting evolution follow slightly different paths in different basins and mountain-shadowed interiors. New seaways also changed climate by redistributing heat, because water carries warmth more efficiently than air, and coastlines shape where storms form and where rain falls. Geography was not a silent backdrop. It was a slow editor, revising the conditions that decide which strategies thrive. The world was being prepared, quietly, for the botanical and ecological revolutions of the Cretaceous. The Jurassic did not end with a single clean break, but with gradual turnovers and shifting emphasis as sea levels, climates, and habitats adjusted into new configurations. Many groups carried on across the boundary into the early Cretaceous, while some lineages declined regionally and others expanded, reflecting a planet whose map and chemistry were still in motion. Reef communities changed as ocean circulation and nutrient patterns evolved, and on land, plant distributions shifted with climate belts that followed drifting continents. Dinosaurs remained dominant, yet their diversity was not frozen in one pattern. It continued to experiment with size, armor, feeding styles, and social behaviors. In the shadows, mammals and birds persisted and diversified in their own quieter ways, taking advantage of every new edge created by rivers, coasts, and forests. The end of an era in deep time often looks like this, not a slammed door, but a long corridor where one chapter blends into the next. The story remained continuous, and the planet kept turning the page. In the early Cretaceous, the familiar green of conifers and ferns began to share space with a quieter innovation that would later transform every landscape. Flowering plants appeared as small, unassuming pioneers, often along river margins and disturbed ground where fast life can win. A flower concentrates reproduction into a focused structure, and that focus allows precise timing, protection, and eventually invitation. Instead of relying only on wind, these plants could recruit animals as messengers, turning scent and color into a biological language. Their leaves and stems also offered new chemistries, including varied compounds that deter or negotiate with herbivores. This was not an overnight takeover, but a gradual widening of options, as flowering plants tested what worked in shade, sun, wet ground, and drought. the land did not change its cast. It changed its rules for success. As flowers multiplied, insects answered with an expansion of senses and behaviors, and the relationship between plant and pollinator became a living handshake repeated millions of times. Nectar and pollen offered food, while petals, scents, and ultraviolet patterns guided visiting bodies with remarkable precision. Some insects evolved mouthparts shaped for particular blooms, while some plants evolved forms that fit particular visitors, making cooperation feel almost mechanical, though it remained wild and flexible. Fruits added another pathway, wrapping seeds in sweetness or color so animals would carry them away and drop them elsewhere. A seed moved in a gut or a beak can travel farther than one carried by wind, and distance can be a powerful ally in a shifting world. In this way, flowering plants accelerated dispersal, increased diversity, and created seasonal pulses of resources that rippled through food webs. The Cretaceous air began to carry new perfumes. Soils changed too, because the kind of litter a forest drops decides how quickly nutrients return to roots. Many flowering plants produce leaves that decay faster than tougher conifer needles, feeding microbes and fungi in a different rhythm and enriching some ground with quicker cycling. Faster decay can mean more available nitrogen and phosphorus, which can support denser plant growth and more insects. And that density can then support more birds and small mammals. Root systems also diversified, and as roots work through sediments, they stabilize banks, slow erosion, and influence how rivers shape floodplains. Rivers, in turn, deliver nutrients to coasts, linking inland forests to marine productivity with every flood. The carbon cycle felt these shifts, because what is buried, what is burned, and what is decomposed, each changes the balance between air and stone. The land's skin became more varied, and the planet's chemistry listened. Herbivorous dinosaurs met these changing plant worlds with a range of feeding tools, turning jaws into instruments that could harvest very different kinds of vegetation. Hadrosaurs, often called duck-billed dinosaurs, carried complex dental batteries that could grind plant material repeatedly, like a conveyor of teeth renewing as they wore down. Ceratopsians evolved beaks and powerful jaw muscles suited to cropping and processing tougher plants close to the ground. Sauropods continued to browse, using reach and bulk to access foliage over wide areas, while armored dinosaurs relied on low browsing and defense, making survival a balance between food and safety. Plant chemistry and plant toughness likely influenced where these herbivores fed and how long they stayed, and their movements would have shaped vegetation in return. Grazing, browsing, trampling, and migration are all forms of landscape editing, and the Cretaceous was full of editors. The forest floor, the canopy, and the open plains each offered a different menu. Predators adapted alongside herbivores, and the Cretaceous world kept refining the relationship between pursuit, defense, and awareness. Some large theropods developed skulls built for powerful bites, while others relied more on speed and repeated strikes, showing that there are many ways to hunt a moving prey in a complex environment. Herd behavior, armor, horns, and sheer size all provided different kinds of protection, and none was perfect in every setting, so evolution spread its bets. Birds diversified into many forms, some specialized for fish, others for insects and seeds, and their flight made rivers, coasts, and forests feel closer together. Mammals remained mostly small, yet they became more diverse in diet and behavior, and some began to exploit new foods such as seeds, fruits, and insects abundant in flowering plant ecosystems. Even tiny animals can reshape ecosystems by controlling insects, dispersing seeds, and recycling nutrients. The Cretaceous was not only the age of giants, it was also an age of busy smallness. At sea, the Cretaceous often ran warm, and sea level stood high enough that broad interior seaways flooded parts of continents, turning land into long peninsulas and shallow marine corridors. These shallow seas are bright and productive because sunlight can penetrate widely, and because winds and tides mix nutrients into the surface waters. Coastlines multiplied, and with them came estuaries, deltas, and wetlands that served as nurseries for fish and invertebrates. Warm waters can also stratify, with lighter surface layers resisting mixing with deeper water, and that stratification can shape oxygen distribution in the depths. Reefs and carbonate platforms grew where water stayed clear and chemistry remained supportive, while other regions shifted between fertility and stress as currents and nutrient loads changed. The ocean's surface looked calm, yet its chemistry could change with small rearrangements of circulation. The sea became a warm engine with many moving parts. Microscopic plankton were among the most influential Cretaceous architects because their shells and plates built sediments that later became vast rock layers. Coccolithophores, tiny algae that make calcium carbonate plates, contributed to thick chalk deposits when their remains settled through quiet water like pale snow. In some intervals, the ocean experienced widespread low oxygen conditions that left organic rich layers behind, a sign of strong productivity combined with weak deep mixing. These ocean anoxic events are recorded not as drama, but as chemistry, with black shales and shifts in isotopes that speak of carbon cycling in unusual balance. When organic matter is buried rather than decomposed, carbon is moved from the active ocean atmosphere system into long-term storage, and that can subtly influence climate over time. The seafloor kept these records with calm patience. Even the smallest shells helped write the planet's history. Later in the Cretaceous, marine food webs supported large hunters such as mosasaurs, powerful reptiles that patrolled warm seas, while sharks and bony fish continued to diversify into many styles of pursuit and schooling. Pterosaurs and seabirds traced long arcs above coastlines, linking islands and deltas in their daily routes, and their fossils hint at a sky filled with wings. On land, flowering plants continued to spread, and in some high-latitude regions forests grew under long summer daylight, showing that warmth reached far north and south compared with later times. Dinosaurs remained diverse across continents that were increasingly separated, and those separations encouraged regional differences in species and ecosystems. The world was full, connected by currents and winds, yet also partitioned by drifting geography. This is the kind of fullness that can persist for millions of years, and it is also the kind that reveals how much life depends on light, chemistry, and continuity. Late in the Cretaceous, continents were far enough apart that coastlines multiplied and regional worlds grew more distinct. A species that thrived on one landmass could no longer easily spread to another, so evolution began to paint different provinces of dinosaurs, plants, and small animals on each drifting stage. Mountain belts rose in places where plates pressed, redirecting winds and shaping rainfall, while broad river systems carried sediments into deltas that expanded and shifted with sea level. In many regions, forests mixed older conifers with increasing patches of flowering trees and shrubs, creating layered habitats with new foods at different heights. The same planet held humid coasts, inland plains, and highland slopes, each with its own seasonal logic. Geography was not simply moving land, it was moving climates, and climates were moving communities quietly and relentlessly. As flowering plants spread, they reshaped the work of insects, and insect diversity became a humming infrastructure beneath larger life. Many beetles, flies, bees, and butterflies found new niches in petals, pollen, and fruit, and their life cycles synchronized with blooming seasons like living clocks. Plants responded by refining timing and structure, concentrating rewards in certain hours or certain weeks, and that selectivity encouraged specialized visitors. Insects then became food for birds, lizards, amphibians, and small mammals, making pollination networks also feeding networks. Fallen leaves and rotting fruit fed soil microbes and fungi, which returned nutrients to roots, accelerating local cycles in places where flowering litter decomposed quickly. A forest can be understood as trunks and canopies, yet its true engine often sits in the smallest mouths and the smallest enzymes. The Cretaceous forest learned new rhythms, and the air carried their delicate signatures. Herbivorous dinosaurs continued to diversify, and their bodies often reflected the landscapes they harvested. Hadrosaurs and ceratopsians could process plants with remarkable efficiency, using complex teeth and strong jaw muscles to handle tough or fibrous material. Sauropods persisted in many regions, browsing broadly and turning height into access, while armored forms relied on defense and low browsing along edges and open ground. These animals were not only consumers, they were movers of nutrients, carrying plant matter across kilometers, miles, and returning it to soil in concentrated deposits that fed insects and microbes. Their migrations and feeding paths could open clearings and maintain mosaics of regrowth, shaping vegetation over years and generations. Where herds traveled, landscapes became patterned, and those patterns created opportunities for smaller animals that lived in the wake of big footsteps. Predators of the late Cretaceous lived within these shifting mosaics, balancing strength, speed, and sensory awareness in different ways. Some large theropods carried skulls built for powerful bites, while others may have relied on repeated strikes and endurance, showing that there is no single blueprint for being a hunter. Hunting is also shaped by terrain, because forests offer ambush while open plains offer pursuit, and rivers and deltas create corridors where prey must cross. Many prey animals use group behavior, horns, armor, or size as defenses, and each defense influenced how predators approached and selected targets. Scavenging remained part of the economy, because a large carcass is a resource that draws many mouths, from small mammals to insects to microbes. In this way, death became recycling, and recycling became stability, keeping energy moving through the web. The late Cretaceous ocean remained a vast engine of plankton, currents, and chemistry, yet it also showed signs of change as sea level and circulation shifted. In some intervals, broad, shallow seas withdrew from continental interiors, reducing shelf habitat and changing where nutrients mixed into surface waters. Where warm surface layers resisted mixing, deeper waters could become oxygen poor, and that pattern would reshape which communities thrived at depth. Reefs persisted where conditions stayed clear and balanced, while other coastal areas became dominated by different builders and sediment types, depending on runoff and temperature. Fish schools, sharks, and marine reptiles continued to patrol these waters, and seabirds and pterosaurs linked coasts and open seas with long daily flights. The sea surface could look untroubled, yet its internal structure depended on the invisible choreography of density, wind, and salt. Near the end of the Cretaceous, volcanism in what is now India produced vast outpourings of lava known as the Deccan Traps, releasing gases over extended time. Such eruptions can add carbon dioxide to the atmosphere and aerosols to the stratosphere, influencing temperature and rainfall patterns, and nudging ocean chemistry as carbon dioxide dissolves into seawater. The details of timing and impact are still refined by geologists, yet the broader point is clear. Earth sometimes turns multiple knobs at once, and ecosystems must respond to a shifting background even before any single dramatic event occurs. Rivers carry the chemical consequences of altered weathering to coasts, and changes in plant cover can adjust how quickly soils form and erode. Life in the late Cretaceous was strong, but it was living on a planet whose deep interior was still speaking through fire. By the last million years of the Cretaceous, many lineages were abundant and widespread, yet their success depended on continuity in light and food chains. Plants and plankton sit at the base, and when their productivity changes, the effects can climb upward through herbivores and predators with surprising reach. Large animals require sustained landscapes because their lives are built on seasons, nesting grounds, and migration routes that work only if habitats remain connected. In the ocean, the smallest producers determine how much energy enters the system, and slight changes in circulation can shift that entry from one region to another. This is what makes ecosystems both resilient and sensitive. Many parts can adapt, yet the whole depends on flows that must keep moving. The Cretaceous biosphere was a full orchestra, and its music relied on the steady arrival of sunlight each day. In the moments before the boundary that ends the Cretaceous, Earth was still a planet of long summers, busy coasts, and continents carrying distinct living communities. Forests and plains held dinosaurs of many kinds, while birds and small mammals filled niches that ranged from insect hunting to seed eating to quiet life in burrows and undergrowth. Rivers braided across floodplains, deltas shifted with sediment and sea level, and shallow seas hosted plankton blooms that would later become rock layers. Everything about this world suggests continuity, the sense that the web could keep renewing itself for millions of years more. Yet deep time also includes rare interruptions, events that arrive not as gradual drift, but as sudden change in the sky and in the chemistry of the air. The story is about to meet one of those interruptions, written not by biology, but by celestial motion and impact. A rocky body, about 10 kilometers, around 6 miles, across struck Earth roughly 66 million years ago, and the collision changed the planet by changing the light. The impact excavated the Chicxulub crater, about 180 kilometers, around 110 miles, wide and lofted pulverized rock high enough to circle the globe. Fine dust and sulfate aerosols formed from sulfur-rich rocks, spreading through the upper atmosphere where winds can carry them across continents and oceans. For a time, sunlight at the surface was reduced, and the world's daily energy budget tightened. In many regions, wildfires likely added soot that joined the airborne haze. The biosphere's great engine, photosynthesis, depends on clear light, so dimming the sky pressed on food webs from the bottom upward. Even far from the crater, noon could feel muted. In the months and years that followed, the atmosphere behaved like a filter, and the ocean responded with altered temperature and chemistry. Cooler surface waters can mix differently with deeper layers, shifting where nutrients rise and where oxygen is renewed. Particles settling out of the sky changed water clarity, and some regions likely saw pulses of acidic rain and sulfate deposition that modified soils and coastal runoff. When plant growth on land falters, less organic matter reaches rivers and deltas, while in the sea, reduced surface productivity can thin the energy supply for everything above it. As dust fell away, sunlight returned unevenly, and ecosystems recovered at different speeds depending on latitude, season, and currents. Chemistry kept moving even in darkness, because microbes can live on gradients that do not require sun. Seawater carbonate chemistry also shifted as it absorbed gases. The boundary between the Cretaceous and Paleogene is recorded as a thin global layer that geologists can trace like a seam in stone. It often contains unusually high iridium, an element more common in many meteorites than in Earth's crust, along with tiny shock features in minerals that form under extreme pressure. Spherules of once molten material, later cooled into glassy grains, appear in some sites, a fine rain preserved in sediment. Above that line, pollen and microfossils change abruptly, signaling that familiar communities had been rearranged. In the oceans, some plankton groups decline sharply, and on land, many large animal lineages vanish from the record, leaving a cleaner, quieter cast. This is how deep time timestamps itself, not with a calendar, but with a chemical signature shared across the planet. That single layer lets distant outcrops speak the same date. Recovery favored organisms that could shelter, endure, and switch diets when familiar food chains thinned. Seeds and spores can wait through bad seasons, and burrowing or aquatic refuges buffer temperature and humidity, giving many small animals a stable corner of the world. On land, hardy pioneer plants stabilized soils first, then shrubs and trees followed, rebuilding shade and moisture step by step. In rivers and lakes, food webs often rebound faster because water moderates extremes and concentrates nutrients, allowing insects and fish to return quickly. In the sea, once light levels improved, plankton blooms could restart the entire ladder of life, from filter feeders up to larger hunters. Each returning organism also returned interactions, pollination, grazing, decomposition, and the slow rebuilding of soils. The world did not restore an old pattern so much as assemble a workable new one. Life rebuilt its habitats as carefully as a reef rebuilds after a storm. In the early Paleocene, forests spread again across many regions, and mammals began exploring ecological space with quiet variety. Most were still small, but their teeth and limbs diversified, reflecting new diets from insects and seeds to leaves and fruit. Birds also radiated into many forms, some adapted to shoreline feeding, others to forest canopies, turning flight into a daily bridge between habitats. Without the largest herbivorous dinosaurs, vegetation patterns shifted, and new browsing pressures emerged from different mouths and different metabolisms. Some mammals became better climbers, turning branches into highways, while others became better runners on open ground where floodplains widened and dried seasonally. Insects diversified with the plants, and fungi and microbes continued their ancient work, stitching nutrients back into roots. The living world regained complexity, not as a copy of the old world, but as a fresh arrangement of familiar atoms. In Paleocene seas, the rebuilding of plankton communities set the pace for everything larger, because the ocean's energy begins as microscopic light capture. After the boundary, some groups declined sharply. Then new assemblages rose, and that turnover affected how carbon sank to depth and how seafloor sediments accumulated. Where organic matter sank and decomposed, oxygen demand increased, so circulation patterns mattered, deciding which basins stayed well ventilated and which drifted toward low oxygen chemistry. coastal shelves remained especially important because shallow water mixes readily and supports dense food webs, feeding fish, seabirds, and marine mammals later in time. As calcium carbonate producers recovered, they helped restore the steady rain of shells that becomes limestone and chalk, tying biology back to geology. In this way, the sea healed by rebuilding its smallest makers first, and everything else followed their return in sequence. The seafloor kept the record in microfossils, turning plankton into a readable history. Around 56 million years ago, Earth entered a rapid warming interval that left a clear imprint in carbon isotopes, as if the planet's carbon cycle changed its accent. This episode, called the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum, is marked by a pronounced shift toward lighter carbon in sediments and fossils, consistent with a large release of carbon into the ocean atmosphere system. Warmer water holds less dissolved oxygen, and warming can strengthen stratification, making some deep regions harder to ventilate, even as surface waters remain productive. Ocean acidity can also shift when more carbon dioxide dissolves into seawater, changing the balance of carbonate ions used by many shell builders. On land, ranges of plants and animals migrated, tracking temperature and rainfall patterns that had moved like invisible borders. The event unfolded quickly in geological terms, and then eased, but it left a lasting signature in sediments and in the evolutionary pathways of multiple lineages. The planet carried forward the consequences in new distributions and new adaptations. In the warm Eocene that followed, forests reached toward high latitudes, and ecosystems grew lush even where winter darkness still arrived. Fossils and sediments indicate broadleaf trees grew far north, while mild conditions allowed turtle and crocodilian relatives to live in regions later shaped by ice. In these forests, primate relatives refined grasping hands and forward-facing vision, turning branches into pathways and fruit into a dependable currency of calories. Birds and insects diversified in tandem with flowering plants, strengthening pollination networks and seasonal pulses of food. In the oceans, mammals were beginning to experiment more boldly with coastal life, setting the stage for later whales by revisiting shorelines rich with fish and invertebrates. The Eocene world shows how climate can widen the living map, inviting lineages to test new habitats and new behaviors. Warmth did not simplify nature. It multiplied niches, and niches multiplied stories. Life answered the canopy, the shoreline, and the soil, with new experiments in form and behavior. As the Eocene warmed the seas, some mammals began to treat coastlines as corridors rather than boundaries, and the line that would become whales stepped deeper into water. Early whale relatives still walked on land, yet their ankles and teeth reveal kinship with hoofed mammals, a reminder that ocean giants began with ordinary steps. In estuaries and shallow bays, they hunted fish and crustaceans, and bodies that swam better gained access to richer feeding grounds. Forelimbs stiffened into steering paddles, hind limbs shrank, and the spine became a flexible spring for swimming. The pelvis loosened, and the tail took over as the main engine, pushing water in broad, efficient strokes. Nostrils migrated upward, making surface breaths quicker, while ears and balance systems adapted to a medium where sound carries far. Some lineages began mating and giving birth in water, freeing them from the need to return to shore. Over millions of years, those coastal swimmers became fully marine archaeocetes, built for distance and depth. Once whales committed to the open ocean, their bodies converged on a sleek grammar of life in water. Streamlining reduces drag, blubber stores energy and buffers temperature change, and a powerful tail fluke turns muscle into steady travel across basins. By the Oligocene, whale lineages split toward two enduring strategies: toothed hunters and baleen filter feeders. Toothed whales kept grasping teeth and, in several groups, evolved echolocation, sending rapid clicks into darkness and reading the returning echoes as shape and distance. Baleen whales replaced teeth with fringed plates of keratin that sieve tiny prey from mouthfuls of water, turning swarms into sustenance. Skulls reshaped to house these methods, jaws lengthened, and the nostrils shifted into a blowhole atop the head. Migration, diving, and long fasting seasons became possible because fat, blood chemistry, and lungs were tuned to conserve oxygen. The sea rewarded any design that could travel far, find food, and return to the surface on time. While some mammals returned to the sea, others mastered the air, and bats turned night into a navigable landscape. Powered flight demands constant control because a wing must adjust to turbulence and sudden turns, and bat hands became wings by stretching skin between elongated fingers. This design allows remarkable maneuverability, especially in forests where insects dart among leaves and branches. Many bats evolved echolocation, emitting high-frequency calls and building a map from echoes, so a moth becomes audible even in complete darkness. Lightweight bones and strong chest muscles help sustain flapping, while a high metabolism supplied the steady energy flight requires. Bats also became important pollinators and seed dispersers in some regions, tying their nightly routes to flowering seasons and fruiting cycles. Here, flight was not merely movement, but a way to harvest space, turning the sky into a feeding ground and a refuge. In the Paleogene canopy, wings and sound found each other and made the darkness useful. As the Eocene gave way to the Oligocene, about 34 million years ago, Earth cooled and Antarctica began to hold a far more persistent mantle of ice. Tectonic shifts opened Southern Ocean gateways, including the widening Drake Passage and the Tasman Gateway, allowing water to circulate more freely around the continent. That circulation helped isolate Antarctica from warmer currents, and once ice expanded, its bright surface reflected sunlight, reinforcing cold in a powerful feedback. Sea level fell as water was stored on land as ice, exposing shelves in some regions and reshaping coastlines in others. Cooling also altered rainfall belts, so forests retreated in places where drier air prevailed, while seasonal contrasts sharpened across broad interiors. The change was not a single snap, but the establishment of a new baseline, a colder mood in the atmosphere and ocean. From this point forward, ice became a stable character in the story, influencing winds, currents, and the geography of habitats. Ocean circulation reorganized with that cooling because temperature and salinity decide which waters sink and which remain afloat. A strengthening Antarctic circumpolar current acted like a moving ring, helping keep southern waters cold and limiting exchanges with subtropical flow. Where cold, salty water formed and sank, it helped ventilate the deep ocean, carrying oxygen downward and setting the pace for long, slow currents that lace the basins. At the surface, winds and currents determined where nutrients rose from depth, and nutrients decide where plankton blooms can thicken into food for everything else. In some places, cooler seas mixed more readily, while in others, stratification persisted, creating patchwork regions of richer and poorer water. These shifts echo through geology, because when organic matter sinks and is buried, carbon is stored. When it decomposes, oxygen is consumed. The ocean, like a vast lung, kept breathing, but its breathing pattern changed with the planet's new temperature map. On land during the Oligocene, cooler and often drier conditions encouraged habitats that were less uniformly forested, with broader mosaics of woodland, shrubland, and open ground. Grasses had existed for a long time, but now they gained more room in scattered patches, especially where fire, drought, and grazing kept trees from closing the canopy. Mammals diversified into new feeding styles, and teeth began to show adaptations for tougher, dustier diets, with higher crowns that resisted wear. Early horses became more specialized runners, some lineages lengthening limbs and shifting weight onto fewer toes, while many hoofed browsers experimented with new gut systems for processing fibrous plants. Small carnivores and birds of prey followed these changes because open spaces favor keen vision and rapid pursuit. Soils too changed as plant cover altered erosion and nutrient cycling, linking climate to the ground's texture. The Oligocene land was learning seasonality, and mammals learned to read it in grass, leaf, and wind. In Oligocene seas, the split between toothed and baleen whales unfolded alongside changing productivity, as cooler waters and evolving currents concentrated food in certain regions. Baleen feeding works best when tiny prey gather in dense clouds, so ocean fronts and upwelling zones became roaming banquets, and whales that could travel far gained access to shifting feasts. Toothed whales hunted fish and squid in three-dimensional space, and some lineages refined sonar-like sensing to find prey even in dark or turbid water. Diatoms, plankton with glassy shells, grew increasingly important in many cooler, nutrient-rich waters, and their blooms helped support dense marine food webs. Where these microscopic makers flourished, they fed crustaceans and fish, which in turn fed seabirds and marine mammals, building tall pyramids of life from a thin green surface layer. On the seafloor, the remains of plankton settled into sediments, turning seasons of bloom into long-term geological archives. The ocean's abundance, as always, began with light and ended as stone. By the late Oligocene, Earth had settled into a cooler baseline than the Eocene's lush warmth, and the biosphere responded with resilience rather than retreat. Ice on Antarctica acted as a steady reservoir that influenced sea level and currents, while continents continued to drift, repositioning coastlines and mountain belts with patient inevitability. Seasonal contrast grew more pronounced in many regions, favoring animals that could migrate, shelter, or exploit different foods at different times of year. Forests persisted where moisture and warmth allowed, but open habitats gained importance as corridors, letting runners, grazers, and wide-ranging predators develop new ecologies. In the sea, the combination of cooler water and strong winds helped create productive margins where upwelling could feed entire communities, from plankton to whales. Through all of this, microbes remained the silent custodians of chemistry, recycling carbon and nitrogen and keeping ecosystems supplied. The stage was being set for an age when modern-style ecosystems would become more recognizable, shaped by grass, fire, mountains, and currents. In the late Oligocene, continents continued their slow negotiations, and those negotiations shaped climate without any need for sudden drama. The broad Tethys Seaway that once linked warm waters across much of the world was narrowing, while uplift in several regions raised new highlands into the path of winds. When mountains rise, they cool air and wring out moisture, creating wet windward slopes and drier rain shadows beyond. Freshly exposed rock also weathers more readily, and weathering consumes carbon dioxide, locking some carbon into minerals that eventually reach the sea. This is one way geology can lean on climate over long spans, not with a single switch, but with many small levers pulled patiently. Rivers carried the products of erosion to coasts, feeding plankton and shell builders, while also changing how sediments accumulated. The planet was tuning its atmosphere and oceans through stone. Across these changing landscapes, primates continued to diversify where forests and woodlands offered fruit, leaves, insects, and shelter in branches. Many primates rely on grasping hands and forward-facing eyes, and those features are especially useful in a three-dimensional canopy, where distance must be judged precisely. As climates cooled and became more seasonal in some regions, forests could break into patches, and patchiness favors flexible diets and social awareness. A group that can remember fruiting trees, share vigilance, and teach young where to feed gains an edge without needing greater size. Teeth and jaw shapes in fossils hint at shifting menus, some lineages leaning toward softer fruit, others incorporating tougher leaves or seeds. The forest floor also mattered, because fallen fruit attracts insects and small vertebrates, and those in turn attract predators. In this way, canopy and ground remained linked, and primate evolution stayed tied to the living architecture of trees. In parts of Africa, the primate story began to include more ape-like forms as the Miocene approached, and those lineages experimented with new ways to move and feed. Apes tend to have more flexible shoulders and arms suited to climbing and hanging, and their bodies can treat branches as a network of roots rather than as obstacles. Some early apes lived in warm forests, while others likely used mosaics of woodland and more open ground, depending on rainfall and season. Where fruit is seasonal, a body that can travel efficiently and a mind that can remember timing and location become valuable tools. Teeth again provide clues, with some fossils showing adaptations for mixed diets rather than a single specialty. Even in this era, Africa was not a single habitat, but a quilt of regions shaped by elevation, winds, and coastal influences. Life was learning how to live in patchwork. As the Miocene began, roughly 23 million years ago, Earth entered a long interval when modern-style ecosystems started to become more recognizable, even though the details were still in motion. Global temperatures were generally warmer than today early in the period, and forests spread widely where moisture allowed, while open habitats expanded where seasonality and fire favored them. In the oceans, evolving currents and stronger winds along some coasts promoted upwelling, lifting nutrients to the surface and feeding dense plankton blooms. Where blooms concentrate, fish schools follow, and where fish gather, seabirds and marine mammals find reliable routes of abundance. On land, hoofed mammals diversified, and some lineages trended toward longer limbs and more efficient travel, useful in habitats that demanded range rather than shelter. The planet was not reinventing life from scratch. It was refining the arrangement, nudging communities toward patterns that could persist through stronger seasons and wider migrations. During the Middle Miocene, warmth peaked in an interval often called the Mid-Miocene climatic optimum, and that warmth left traces in marine sediments and fossil communities. Higher temperatures can change rainfall belts, expand forests in some places, and intensify evaporation in others, sharpening contrast between wet and dry regions. In the sea, warmth influences stratification, and stratification influences where oxygen reaches the deep and where nutrients return to the surface. So productivity belts can shift like slow-moving ribbons. As conditions changed again and cooling resumed, habitats that had expanded under warmth could contract, and open environments gained more importance in some interiors. This back and forth is a common deep time pattern. Warmth widens certain opportunities, cooling widens others, and evolution learns both vocabularies. Fossil pollen and ancient soils preserve these changes in vegetation, while marine microfossils record shifts in temperature and nutrient regimes. The planet kept its own diary in mud. As cooling and drying progressed in many regions later in the Miocene, grasses spread more widely, and some grasslands became persistent rather than temporary. Grasses tolerate grazing because they grow from their base, and they can rebound after fire, making them well suited to landscapes with seasonal drought and frequent disturbance. In several places, a photosynthetic strategy called C4 became more common in grasses, especially under warm, bright, and sometimes water-stressed conditions, though the timing differs by region. This botanical shift changed what it meant to eat, because grass blades often carry silica and because dry seasons bring dust, both of which increase tooth wear. Herbivores responded with higher crown teeth and more complex chewing surfaces, turning abrasion into a manageable cost. The spread of grass also altered soils through dense root mats that stabilize ground and store carbon below the surface. The open horizon became a habitat with its own disciplines. Grazing mammals diversified into herds and specialists, and their bodies began to reflect the demands of distance and endurance. Longer legs and more efficient gaits reduces the cost of travel, and travel matters when food is spread across wide plains that change with season and fire. Ruminant digestion, with its multi-chambered system, allowed many herbivores to extract more nutrition from tough plants, while horses and other grazers refined teeth built to withstand grit and silica. Predators adapted in parallel, because open habitats reward keen vision and rapid pursuit, and they also reward teamwork where cooperation pays. Fire remained a powerful editor, keeping some regions open and recycling nutrients back into soil, while hooves and burrowing animals mixed ground and influenced which plants could take hold. Even dust played a role, carrying minerals and shaping plant stress, then settling again to become part of the soil. Grasslands were not empty spaces. They were complex machines driven by sun, wind, and teeth. In the Miocene Ocean, productivity often gathered along certain margins, where winds pushed surface water aside and cold, nutrient-rich water rose to replace it. Such upwelling zones feed plankton, and plankton feed fish, and fish feed an entire architecture of seabirds and marine mammals, creating coastal abundance that can persist for millions of years. Kelp forests expanded in some temperate seas, building underwater canopies that shelter countless species, while diatoms, plankton with glassy shells, became especially important producers in many nutrient-rich waters. Baleen whales refined filter feeding, turning dense swarms of small prey into nourishment, and toothed whales diversified into hunters that use speed, sensing, and, in some groups, echolocation. These marine systems show how the sea concentrates life, where physics concentrates nutrients, making coastlines into long-moving pastures. Even the seafloor kept score, as sinking remains accumulated into layered sediments that still speak of ancient blooms. On land, mountain building continued to reshape climate and habitats, as uplift strengthened some monsoon patterns and dried other regions in rain shadows. The Himalaya and Tibetan Plateau, among other rising regions, influenced wind circulation by lifting terrain into the atmosphere's flow, changing where moisture fell and where deserts could expand. In the Americas, uplift also altered river routes and created new highlands that hosted cooler ecosystems above surrounding lowlands. These changes mattered to life because they changed where forests could hold, where grasslands could spread, and where migration corridors opened or closed. Weathering on new slopes consumed carbon dioxide over long spans, linking uplift to the chemistry of air and sea in a slow, persistent way. Rivers carried eroded minerals into the ocean, sometimes feeding coastal productivity and tying mountain storms to marine blooms far downstream. Geography kept rewriting the conditions, and ecosystems kept learning new shapes in response. Around 3 million years ago, a narrow bridge of land rose where the Atlantic and Pacific once freely exchanged water, and ocean circulation adjusted as if a door had quietly closed. The Isthmus of Panama redirected currents, strengthening patterns that carried warm water northward in the Atlantic and changing where salt accumulated. Saltier surface water can sink more readily in cold regions, feeding deep water formation and influencing the slow global conveyor that ventilates the deep sea with oxygen. On land, the same bridge connected two continents, allowing animals and plants to migrate in both directions and reshaping ecosystems through new competition and new opportunities. In the seas, upwelling zones and nutrient pathways shifted as currents reorganized around the new geography. A strip of land only tens of kilometers, tens of miles wide became a powerful switch for climate and biogeography. Geography does not need to be large to be decisive. In the Pliocene, climates were often a little warmer than today, and sea levels stood higher in some intervals, leaving coastal terraces that later hardened into stone. Warmer conditions can push forests poleward and keep high-latitude regions less icy, while still allowing deserts and dry grasslands where winds and rain shadows favor them. Ocean temperatures influence where storms form, and storms decide how rivers feed deltas and how nutrients reach coastal seas. As the Pliocene progressed, long-term cooling continued, shaped by changing gateways, uplift, and the reflective power of growing ice in high latitudes. The world held a mix of familiar ingredients: forests, grasslands, reefs, and plankton blooms. Yet their borders wandered over thousands of years like slow curtains. The living map remained dynamic, and evolution kept adjusting its footholds to match. Even a modest shift in average temperature can move habitats far. By about 2.6 million years ago, Earth entered the Quaternary, and repeated glacial cycles began to pace landscapes with a steady astronomical rhythm. Small changes in Earth's orbit and tilt alter where and when sunlight arrives, especially in high-latitude summers, and that seasonal bookkeeping can determine whether winter snow melts away or persists to build ice. Earlier cycles often lean strongly on a 41,000-year rhythm. Then later, many glacial swings emphasized longer intervals near 100,000 years, as ice sheets and carbon cycles responded in more complex feedbacks. Cooling oceans, expanding sea ice, and dustier continents all influenced how much carbon dioxide remained in the air versus dissolved in seawater or stored in soils. These cycles were not identical copies. Each one had its own timing and intensity. Still, the repeating pattern gave life a new kind of calendar, written in ice and sunlight. When ice sheets expanded across North America and Eurasia, they reshaped the planet's surface with quiet force, carving valleys and pressing down the crust. At their greatest extent, parts of these ice masses approached about 3 kilometers, around 2 miles, thick, enough to flatten hills into gentle contours and grind rock into fine mineral flour. sea level fell as water was stored on land, dropping by roughly 120 meters, about 400 feet, during major glacial maxima and exposing continental shelves as wide plains. Rivers cut new channels across these temporary lands, and coastlines shifted outward, changing the shape of shallow seas and the placement of productive estuaries. As ice advanced and retreated, it left moraines and outwash plains that redirected drainage and created countless lakes in scoured basins. The Earth's skin became a palimpsest, rewritten by each cycle's reach. Dust became one of the Quaternary's subtle messengers, lifted from dry plains and glacial outwash and carried far by wind before settling again. Thick blankets of loess formed downwind of ice margins, building fertile soils that would later support dense plant growth because fine mineral grains hold water and nutrients efficiently. Over oceans, dust delivered iron, a micronutrient that can limit plankton growth in some regions, so a dusty atmosphere could fertilize blooms and influence how much carbon sank into the deep as organic matter. Sinking carbon acts like a slow elevator, moving surface carbon into long-term storage and tying wind patterns to the chemistry of seawater. In this way, deserts and ice sheets could reach across thousands of kilometers, thousands of miles, to influence fisheries and oxygen levels far offshore. A grain of dust is small, yet in deep time it becomes a lever. The atmosphere carried these grains like mailed letters between continents and seas. As climate belts shifted back and forth, ecosystems migrated, and migration left signatures that still appear in the genetic patterns of many species. During colder phases, forests often retreated toward refuges, protected regions where temperature and moisture stayed within workable bounds, while grasslands and steppe expanded elsewhere. When warmth returned, forests advanced again, but not always from the same sources, so the resulting spread could stitch together lineages that had been separated for thousands of years. Animals tracked these moving habitats, sometimes expanding across newly exposed shelves, sometimes contracting into valleys and peninsulas when ice or aridity tightened the map. The stop-and-go rhythm encouraged divergence and then reunion, a repeated experiment in isolation and mixing. Even marine species felt it as sea levels rose and fell, shifting coastlines and shallow nurseries. The biosphere learned to treat geography as temporary, and temporariness became part of evolution's texture. Ocean circulation also changed with glacial cycles, because temperature and salinity decide which waters sink and which remain at the surface. Cooler air and altered winds can strengthen mixing in some regions, while expanding sea ice can suppress it in others, reshaping where deep waters form and how oxygen is delivered to the abyss. The Atlantic's deep circulation, for example, can weaken or reorganize under different freshwater and temperature balances, influencing how heat is carried northward and how nutrients are distributed. These shifts affect plankton productivity, and productivity affects how much carbon is drawn down from the surface and exported to depth. Over long spans, carbonate sediments on the seafloor respond too, dissolving or accumulating, depending on acidity and carbon storage in the deep ocean. The sea behaves like a vast memory system, holding chemical states for centuries and millennia before releasing them back to the surface. Each glacial cycle wrote a slightly different pattern into that memory. As the planet moved through interglacials, warmer intervals between major ice advances, coastlines returned inland and modern-looking habitats became more widespread in many regions. Melting ice raised sea level, flooded river valleys into estuaries, and created complex shorelines where fresh and salt water mix into productive nurseries for fish and birds. Forests expanded where moisture allowed, while grasslands persisted where drought, grazing, and fire maintained openness, and deserts held where winds and rain shadows stayed strong. Lakes filled glacial basins and stored layered sediments that record pollen, dust, and volcanic ash like pages in a long archive. Even after ice withdrew, the land continued to rebound upward, slowly lifting former shorelines and reshaping drainage. The world looked calmer, yet it remained in motion, with every coastline and every tree line still sensitive to the balance of sunlight and carbon. In some glacial landscapes, meltwater gathered behind ice dams into enormous lakes that waited like held breath. When an ice barrier failed, water could surge out in floods that scoured valleys, rolled boulders, and laid down broad gravel plains. The channels left behind can look oversized compared with the rivers that occupy them now, and that mismatch is a signature of ancient extremes. These outburst flows carried fine glacial flour into lowlands, turning waters milky and feeding bursts of plankton where nutrients and light aligned. They also rearranged soils, stripping some hillsides bare while building new terraces elsewhere. So plant communities had to recolonize again and again. In a single episode, a region's drainage could be rewritten, lakes could be drained, and deltas could be rebuilt. Ice, usually patient, sometimes released its stored water in a single, decisive gesture, and the land kept the memory in its widened scars. Along coasts, the rise and fall of sea level during glacial cycles created staircases of ancient shorelines, cut and built by waves over thousands of years. When sea level stood high, waves carved platforms and beaches into rock. When it fell, those features were lifted into air and preserved as terraces. In some places, coral reefs tracked these changes by growing upward towards sunlight, then becoming stranded and hardened into limestone when the sea withdrew. A low stand exposed broad shelves, turning shallow seas into windy plains and shifting nurseries for fish and shellfish to the new coastline. A high stand flooded valleys into estuaries where fresh and salt water mingle, creating rich food webs and soft sediments that store pollen, shells, and charcoal like layered pages. Even without dramatic storms, tides and waves steadily sculpted the edge of continents, and that moving edge shaped where nutrients gathered, where wetlands formed, and where life found the most dependable abundance. Across cold steppe tundra landscapes, large herbivores acted as mobile engineers, shaping vegetation through grazing, trampling, and nutrient return. Mammoths, bison, horses, and other grazers cropped grasses and herbs and helped keep shrubs and trees from closing the habitat, especially where dry winds and thin snow favored open ground. Their movement disturbed soil and scattered seeds, creating patches where fast-growing plants could take hold after short summers, while their dung fed insects and microbes that recycled nitrogen and phosphorus back into roots. Predators followed the herds and influenced how animals clustered, migrated, and kept watch, adding another layer of pattern to the plains. In this system, even winter mattered, because hooves could break crusted snow and expose forage beneath, changing what survived the cold season. The open steppe was not emptiness, but a living machine of teeth, wind, and root. When sea level fell, land bridges emerged where shallow seas had once separated continents, creating temporary corridors for plants and animals. Beringia, linking northeastern Asia and northwestern North America, was one such corridor, often more like a broad region than a narrow strip, with its own rivers, grasslands, and cold season storms. Movement across it likely happened in pulses as glaciers advanced and retreated, and as vegetation belts shifted between steppe, shrubland, and sparse forest. Some species expanded during cold, dry phases when open habitat spread, then contracted when wetter conditions returned and tree cover changed the rules. These corridors did not guarantee easy passage because ice margins, mountain ranges, and changing coastlines could still funnel travel into certain routes. Yet over many thousands of years, the corridor acted like a hinge in the map, allowing gene flow, new competitors, and new partnerships to appear on either side. Geography briefly connected worlds, and life used the connection. Toward the end of the last glacial period, warming carried Earth into the Holocene about 11,700 years ago, and living communities tracked the retreating ice like a tide reversing. Meltwater raised seas and flooded river valleys into estuaries, and those brackish margins became nurseries where fish, shellfish, and waterfowl multiplied quickly. On land freshly uncovered by ice, lichens and mosses arrived first, breaking bare rock into crumbs of soil, followed by shrubs and then young forests that stitched slopes together with roots. Rivers, freed from ice dams, rearranged their channels through sand and gravel, leaving braided reaches, oxbow lakes, and new floodplain soils. In lakes that filled glacial basins, plankton blooms fed insects and fish, and layered sediments began recording pollen, charcoal, and silt like a quiet ledger. The post-glacial world did not restart. It repopulated, and life thickened wherever water and sunlight met. Along the new coasts, seaweeds and marsh plants colonized mudflats, turning fresh shoreline into food and shelter. As the Holocene settled in, it became an age of seams and edges, and many species thrived where habitats overlapped. River deltas branched into reed beds, backwaters, and shifting levees, creating mosaics where insects hatched in clouds, fish hunted in channels, and birds nested on higher ground between floods. In forests, canopies turned sunlight into fruit and leaf. Understories held shade-tolerant plants, and fallen logs became miniature worlds for beetles, fungi, and the microbes that return wood to soil. In drier interiors, grasslands persisted where grazing and fire kept trees from closing the horizon, and their dense root mats stored moisture through long summers. Along many shorelines, dunes advanced and retreated, forming temporary ponds that gave amphibians short, rich windows for breeding. None of these landscapes was fixed. Each was a living pattern that repeated with variation, letting complexity build without needing stillness. Seasonal pulses of flowers, insects, and migrating herds made time itself a resource that ecosystems learned to use. In tropical seas, reefs rebuilt their brightest architecture by following sunlight upward, one skeleton at a time. Corals and their symbiotic algae renewed a daily bargain of light for sugar, and the reef turned that bargain into stone cities with alleys, ledges, and crevices for countless small lives. Behind reef rims, lagoons filled with seagrass meadows that bound sand, fed grazers, and sheltered juvenile fish in a forest of blades. Where rivers met the sea, mangroves and salt marsh plants trapped sediment and offered nurseries for crabs, shrimp, and fry, while birds stitched shoreline to offshore waters with constant foraging flights. In cooler oceans, kelp forests rose where nutrient-rich currents met rocky coasts, and their swaying canopies created shade, refuge, and hunting grounds for fish and seals. Across all these habitats, the sea's productivity remained a story of living partnerships stacked in layers. Even the smallest plankton blooms could ripple upward into whales, seabirds, and the chemistry written into shells. On land, the Holocene's quiet revolution often happened underground, where soils matured into busy biochemical cities. Leaf litter and dead roots fed fungi and bacteria that dismantled complex molecules into reusable pieces, releasing nutrients while also building stable organic matter that can persist for centuries. Earthworms, termites, and countless small arthropods mixed minerals with decay, opening pores that hold water and air and giving roots room to explore. In colder or waterlogged places, decomposition slowed and peat accumulated, storing thick layers of plant history and providing habitat for specialized insects, mosses, and birds. In warmer, well-drained soils, faster microbial work returned nutrients quickly, supporting dense plant growth and the insects and small predators that follow it. These soil communities made landscapes resilient. After fire, flood, or storm, regrowth begins when the underground workforce is intact and ready. Mycorrhizal fungi, in particular, extended plant roots like living threads, trading minerals for sugars across invisible networks. As centuries passed, water continued to organize the Holocene biosphere because rivers, lakes, and coasts concentrate food and movement. Floodplains renewed fertility when rivers spilled over banks, and that periodic silt supported tall grasses, browsing animals, and nesting birds in a repeating sequence of green growth and retreating water. Deltas built outward where sediment met calmer seas, forming shifting labyrinths of channels and wetlands that served as nurseries for fish and stopovers for migrations. In dry regions, springs and groundwater anchored oases that drew plants and animals into narrow corridors, turning scarcity into a map of dependable routes. Along coasts, tidal flats and marshes provided shallow feeding grounds where shorebirds could probe and fish could spawn in warmed water. Timing became as important as place because blooms, spawning runs, and migrations often hinge on a few weeks of temperature and flow. The Holocene's rhythms taught life to return, not to stand still. Coastlines in the Holocene were never a single line, but a moving boundary that created new habitats each time. Seas rose or paused. As sea level climbed after the Ice Age, beaches migrated inland, barrier islands shifted, and estuaries formed where fresh and salt water mingle. Coral reefs tracked these changes by growing upward toward light, then becoming stranded as limestone terraces when the sea's position changed again. Those reef staircases sheltered fish and invertebrates while they lived, and later became rock ledges that birds and plants could colonize above the surf. On many shelves, newly flooded shallows turned into seagrass and algal fields that fed grazers and stabilized sediments, making clear water easier to keep. Storms could break reefs into rubble, yet that rubble often became new substrate for regrowth, so recovery was built into the design. Along every shifting shore, life practiced persistence by rebuilding in place even when the boundary moved. Even in a relatively steady Holocene, patterns like El Niño and La Niña rearranged rainfall and ocean productivity, and ecosystems learned to flex with them. When warm surface waters shift across the Pacific, coastal upwelling can weaken or strengthen, changing how much plankton grows and how fish schools gather. Those changes ripple to seabirds, seals, and whales that time migrations to reliable feeding grounds, so a distant current can move an entire food web. On land, multi-year swings in wet and dry seasons can favor different plants in the same valley, opening windows for insects that specialize on certain flowers and for predators that follow those insects. Occasional volcanic winters briefly cooled summers and altered harvests for wild plants, which in turn changed the breeding success of herbivores and the predators behind them. The key lesson is ecological, not meteorological. Variability selects for mobility, flexibility, and networks of refugees where populations can endure a bad run of years. By the early Holocene, Homo sapiens already ranged widely, and our ecological signature began as a pattern of movement and knowledge rather than monuments. People followed coasts, rivers, and grassland corridors where plants and animals concentrate, and tools turned local materials into portable advantages. Fire, used carefully, could open patches of habitat, encouraging fresh growth that attracts grazing animals and the predators that track them. Food sharing and language let information travel faster than genes, so a successful hunting strategy or a new plant use could spread across landscapes in a human lifetime. Even small camps influence nearby ecology by concentrating nutrients, creating middens that attract scavengers and insects and enrich soils. Humans were not outside nature. We were another omnivore learning to read seasons, migrations, and shorelines, and to build cultural memory into survival. As people moved, commensal species such as rodents and certain hardy weeds often traveled with them, beginning a new kind of partnership in plain sight. In several regions, domestication emerged as a long conversation between humans and other species, and it changed evolution's tempo by making selection deliberate. Grasses with larger seeds, legumes that tolerated disturbance, and animals amenable to herding gained advantages in the new niche of cultivated ground. As fields spread, plant communities reorganized into mosaics of crops, weeds, hedgerows, and nearby woodland, and each boundary became habitat for insects, birds, and small mammals. Livestock converted grasses into milk, meat, and manure, returning nutrients to soil and inviting new communities of dung beetles, flies, and microbes to thrive. Irrigation and terracing extended productive land, but they also created wetlands, canals, and salty margins that selected for different plants and aquatic life. Domestication did not replace wild nature. It created a mixed landscape where wild and managed species learned to coexist, compete, and sometimes hybridize. Stored grain also fed rodents and their predators, and the close crowding of people and animals reshaped disease ecology in subtle ways. As agriculture supported larger populations, some settlements became cities, and cities quickly turned into ecosystems with their own food webs and selective pressures. Stone, brick, and timber changed how heat and water moved, creating warmer courtyards, shaded alleys, and drainage channels that favored certain plants and insects. Stored food attracted mice and rats, and those rodents drew owls, cats, and other predators into close association with human life. Markets and ports moved crops, animals, and parasites across seas and mountains, blending biotas that had been separated since the last ice age. Urban waste fed scavengers and soil organisms, sometimes enriching nearby fields, sometimes polluting downstream wetlands and changing which species could persist there. Even the simplest city garden became a meeting place for pollinators, birds, and ornamental plants from far away, turning human preference into evolutionary opportunity. Cities did not end the story of nature. They wrote a dense, fast chapter within it. Over the last few thousand years, long-distance travel braided the world's ecosystems together, and the biology of one coast could arrive suddenly on another. Seeds hidden in ship ballast, insects in timber, and microbes in water barrels crossed oceans with people, sometimes failing, sometimes finding empty niches. When newcomers establish in a new region, They can reorganize food webs by outcompeting local species, bringing new predators or diseases, or altering fire and grazing patterns. Other introductions become mutualisms. Crops meet new pollinators, pasture grasses meet new grazers, and gardens become refuges for species that would otherwise have no habitat nearby. This mixing is not uniquely human in principle, because corridors have always opened and closed, but the speed became extraordinary, compressing biogeographic time into decades. The result is a modern biosphere where range boundaries are often negotiated by transportation routes as much as by rivers or mountains. Some animals, from pigeons to raccoons, thrive in this new geography of roofs, parks, and roadside forests evolving alongside us. In the last few centuries, human technology amplified our reach, and many of the strongest effects on life came through land use, extraction, and nutrient flows. Forests were cleared or replanted, rivers were dammed or redirected, and coastlines were built outward with ports and seawalls, reshaping habitats that once shifted freely. Industrial fishing changed the size structure of marine food webs by removing large predators and compressing the age of many fish populations. On land, synthetic fertilizers increased crop yields and supported billions of people, while excess nutrients sometimes washed into lakes and coasts, fueling blooms that alter oxygen patterns and species composition. Noise, light, and chemical pollution created new selection pressures in cities and along shipping lanes, favoring species that tolerate disturbance and exploit new resources. Yet the same era also produced ecological knowledge at scale, revealing how tightly pollination, soil life, wetlands, reefs, and forests remain connected. Where pressure eases, recovery can be rapid, and protected areas often show reefs, forests, and fisheries rebuilding their complexity. Modern conservation is best understood as an ecological intervention inside the same long story, aiming to keep evolutionary options open. Protected areas shelter breeding colonies, spawning grounds, and old-growth forests where slow life histories still have room to play out. Wildlife corridors reconnect habitats fragmented by roads and farms, letting gene flow resume and allowing migrations to track seasons as they once did. Restoration projects rebuild wetlands that filter water and host amphibians and birds, replant native forests that stabilize soils, and remove barriers so rivers can once again carry sediment to deltas. Seed banks and breeding programs preserve genetic diversity, which is the raw material of adaptation, while community science expands monitoring far beyond what professionals alone could achieve. These efforts are not about freezing nature. They are about keeping ecosystems functional enough that change can be met with resilience rather than collapse. In the sea, catch limits and marine reserves can allow long-lived species to return, restoring the layered structure of food webs. One of the most unusual features of the present day is that a species can measure its planet, and those measurements increasingly focus on life as a moving system. Satellites track seasonal greening, fire scars, algal blooms, and sediment plumes, letting ecologists see migration corridors and habitat loss from orbit. Acoustic arrays listen for whales and for the shifting soundscape of reefs, while camera traps and GPS tags reveal how predators and herbivores share space across whole continents. In rivers and seas, environmental DNA sampling detects species from traces they leave behind, turning a cup of water into a census of hidden communities. Long-term plots and repeat surveys measure not only which species exist, but how timing changes. when flowers open, when insects hatch, when birds arrive, and when fish spawn. This instrumentation does not replace wonder. It adds resolution, showing the biosphere as a living choreography that can be mapped, compared, and understood. Even with modern technology in cities, the biosphere still runs on partnerships that began long before bones, leaves, or flowers appeared. Mycorrhizal fungi continue to trade minerals for sugars, extending roots through soil like a second circulatory system for forests and grasslands. Pollinators still connect blossoms to fruit, and the timing of that connection decides seed set in wild plants and harvests in farms. Microbes still govern decomposition and the release of nutrients, deciding whether carbon and nitrogen return quickly to the food web or remain stored in soil and sediment. In the ocean, phytoplankton still feed the base of almost every marine chain, and their growth still depends on light, mixing, and the micronutrients carried by rivers and winds. Even humans are ecosystems. The microbiome helps digest food and train immunity, reminding us that individuality in biology is often a coalition. Coral reefs, too, depend on symbioses, and when those partnerships change, the entire city of the reef can change with them. Across deep time, the same matter keeps changing homes, moving through bodies, soils, oceans, and rock in loops that never quite repeat. Elements that once sat in basalt became nutrients in a leaf, then food in an insect, then bone in a bird, then dust in a floodplain after death and decay. Shell builders turn dissolved ions into limestone. Trees turn air and sunlight into wood. Bacteria turn waste into usable nitrogen for the next generation. These cycles are the continuity behind every seeming revolution, because evolution can only explore what the planet's chemistry and energy flows make available. What changes from era to era is the arrangement of constraints, where continents sit, where shallow seas spread, which plants dominate the ground, and which animals carry energy upward through food webs. Life is not a ladder of progress. It is a branching set of solutions, each one shaped by the earth that hosts it and by the neighbors it must live with. Seen from far enough away, the biography of life has a clear arc, even though it is made from countless local stories. Chemistry learned heredity, heredity learned ecosystems, and ecosystems learned to reshape the planet that shelters them. Microbes oxygenated air and changed oceans. Complex cells learned cooperation. Bodies learned to build forests, reefs, and grasslands that alter rivers and coasts. Extinctions cleared space, recoveries refilled it, and each refill changed the rules of competition and partnership for what came next. In the Ice Ages, life learned to migrate with moving shorelines and shifting belts of habitat, and in the Holocene, it learned to live in mosaics stitched by water. Humans arrived late and added tools, farms, cities, and global travel. But we did not escape the web. We tightened and rewove it around ourselves. Today, the same planet still sets the terms: sunlight, nutrients, and time. And every species, including ours, negotiates with those terms daily. In the end, Earth remains a world where sunlight meets water, rock, and atmosphere, and life turns that meeting into endlessly varied form. The first cells solved copying and containment. Later, lineages solved multicellularity, flight, wood, shells, and warm blood, each solution opening new ecological rooms. Forests taught rivers to meander through rooted banks, reefs taught waves to break on living stone, and grasslands taught fire and hooves to maintain open space. The present day adds a strange twist. Life can now understand its own deep history, reading genes, fossils, and sediments as one connected record. That understanding does not make nature simpler. It shows how many interactions must work at once for a stable ecosystem to exist. So when we look at a coastline, a forest, or a plankton bloom, we are looking at the latest page of a book written by metabolism, partnership, and time. The story reaches today not as an ending, but as a living present, full of species still adapting, dispersing, and collaborating. The history of life is enormous, but it is also repetitive in a comforting way, because it always returns to the same simple needs: energy, water, shelter, and time. As the narrative settles, remember that every breath you take is part of a very old exchange between organisms and air, and every quiet moment is supported by invisible communities, turning decay into new growth. Nothing in this story was built in a hurry. Reefs required countless nights of feeding, forests required generations of leaffall, and even the fastest migrations still followed the season's pace. So you can let your thoughts slow down and follow that pace now. Let the details blur into a single feeling of continuity. Life changing, returning, and persisting. Relax your shoulders, soften your jaw, and allow the next minutes to belong to rest rather than to remembering. Good night, and thank you for traveling through the history of life on Earth with me. Somewhere, waves are breaking on a shore, insects are settling in grass, and plankton are rising toward the surface, all of it continuing without effort